On the afternoon of the 25th of October 1415, on a narrow field of mud in northern France, the impossible had just happened. The flower of French chivalry, thousands of armored noblemen, the greatest army France could field, lay dead and dying in the churned earth, drowned in mud, cut down by the arrows of a few thousand exhausted, half-starved English archers. It was one of the most crushing victories in the history of war, and the man who had won it was a 29-year-old king named Henry. In time, it would become the most beloved battle in the English story, and he would become its perfect hero. And then, with the field seemingly won, King Henry gave an order. Behind the English line stood thousands of French prisoners, noblemen who had surrendered, thrown down their weapons, expecting to be ransomed as the laws of chivalry required. They were disarmed, they were helpless, and there was a rumor that a fresh French force was regrouping to attack. So Henry ordered them killed. His own soldiers, it is said, hesitated. Killing a rich prisoner meant throwing away a fortune, and there was something in the cold slaughter of surrendered men that even hardened men-at-arms balked at. The king had to detail a squad to do it, and they did it, cutting throats across the field and, the chronicles say, herding some into a barn and burning them alive. This was the same afternoon that, nearly 2 centuries later, William Shakespeare would turn into the most stirring speech in the English language. "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." It is the founding scene of England's favorite hero king. But the prisoners are not in the speech. Neither are the starving children Henry would later leave to die in a ditch, nor the old friend he would burn alive for his beliefs. This is the story of the real Henry V, a king of dazzling brilliance and genuine faith, and a ruthlessness the legend was built to hide. We will keep the greatness. And we will show that it and the ruthlessness were the same man. To understand why Henry V drove himself and everyone around him so hard, why he fought so relentlessly, prayed so fiercely, and killed so coldly, you have to begin not with him, but with the crime that put his family on the throne. Henry was born on the 16th of September, 1386, in a tower of the castle at Monmouth, on the Welsh border. His father was Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, a grandson of King Edward III and one of the great magnates of the realm, but not, in 1386, anywhere near the throne. That throne belonged, by every law of God and man, to the boy's cousin, King Richard II, the anointed sovereign of England, crowned as a child and reigning by unquestioned right of blood. But Richard was a difficult, capricious, and increasingly tyrannical king, and in the last years of the 14th century, his quarrels with his greatest subjects curdled into something fatal. He exiled Bolingbroke, and when Bolingbroke's father died, seized the vast inheritance that should have passed to him. It was a step too far. In 1399, while Richard was away in Ireland, Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile at the head of an army, and the kingdom, sick of Richard, fell into his hands almost without a blow. Richard was captured, forced to abdicate, and shut away in the castle of Pontefract. Bolingbroke took the crown as King Henry IV, and a few months later Richard II, the anointed king, was dead in his prison, almost certainly starved or murdered on the orders of the man who had replaced him. This was the foundation on which the whole house of Lancaster was built, and it was a foundation of sand and blood. For the deposition of Richard was not a lawful succession. It was a usurpation, and the death that followed it was, in the eyes of many, regicide, the killing of God's anointed. There were men in England, and more abroad, who never accepted that Henry IV was the rightful king at all, and who whispered that a crown taken by force and stained with a king's murder could bring no blessing on the line that wore it. That whisper would follow the Lancastrians for the rest of their existence, and in the end it would help to destroy them. The boy in the tower at Monmouth was its heir. He grew up, therefore, in the shadow of a stolen crown, and it shaped everything. His father's reign was not the confident settling in of a secure dynasty. It was a decade of anxiety, rebellion, and illness. Almost from the moment Henry IV took the throne, the men who had helped him take it began to turn against him. The great northern family of the Percys, the Earl of Northumberland and his fiery son, Harry Hotspur, rose in revolt. In Wales, a charismatic nobleman named Owain Glyndwr raised a rebellion that would burn for a decade and for a time threatened to tear Wales away from the English crown entirely. And through it all, the king himself was increasingly a sick man, afflicted by a wasting, disfiguring illness that his enemies were quick to call the visible judgment of God upon a usurper and a regicide. Into this insecure and embattled world, the young Henry was thrust with extraordinary speed. As the eldest son of the new king, he became Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, and heir to a throne that his family did not yet securely hold, and he was expected to fight for it. There was no gilded, sheltered boyhood. By the time he was in his early teens, he was on campaign, learning the hard trade of war not in tournaments but in the grinding, merciless struggle against Glyndŵr in the Welsh mountains, and before he was 17, on the field of a full-scale battle against the Percys that would nearly kill him. The prince was being forged, early and brutally, into a soldier, and something else was being forged in him too, though it is harder to see from this distance, a conviction that the Lancastrian crown had to be earned again and again, and justified before God and man because it had not been earned lawfully in the first place. A dynasty born of usurpation could not rest on its right. It had no clear right. It had to rest on success, on victory, on strong and pious rule, on the visible favor of God demonstrated through triumph. This is the thread to hold from the very beginning, because it runs through everything Henry V would later do. His ferocious energy, his relentless wars, his intense and austere religion, his insistence that God was on the English side and that his conquests were holy work, all of it grew, in part, from the same root, the need of a usurper's son to prove that the crown on his family's head was truly meant to be there. He could not know, as a boy on the Welsh border, how far he would take that need, or what it would cost the people who stood in his way. He could not know that the drive to legitimize a stolen crown would carry him to the mud of Agincourt and the Ditches of Rouen, and would win, in the end, a triumph so complete and so hollow that it would collapse within a single generation and drag England into the longest civil war in its history. All of that was still to come. For now there was only a watchful, serious, and dangerous young prince, growing up in the knowledge that his family's crown was not safe, had never been safe, and would have to be paid for, in his own blood and in a great deal of other people's. Of all the stories told about Henry V, the best loved is the one about the young man he was before the crown. In the popular telling, Prince Henry spent his youth in dissipation and tavern shadow, a wild and idle heir who kept low company in the back streets of Eastcheap, who drank and brawled and robbed alongside a fat, boastful old knight, and who wasted his inheritance in riot until the shock of his father's death sobered him overnight into a king. It is a satisfying story, because it is a story of redemption, proof that a man can be remade in a single night. But it is a story, and a late one. The records of Henry's own century describe no such youth. The wild prince is a creature of literature, not of history. He took shape on the Elizabethan stage, in an old play about the famous victories of Henry V, and then, unforgettably, in the hands of William Shakespeare, who gave the young Hal a drinking companion named Falstaff and a tavern world to be redeemed from nearly 2 centuries after the real prince was dead. Behind the playwright stood the Tudor chroniclers, who liked the shape of a soul reborn and passed the tale from book to book until it hardened into something that looked like fact. The real Prince Henry passed his early years not among rogues, but among captains, clerks, scouts, and armorers. He was not a truant hiding from responsibility. He was a boy handed the instruments of war and government before he had reached his majority and made to use them. He was a child of 12 when his father seized the throne in 1399, and almost at once he was loaded with titles and with the duty that went with them: Prince of Wales, Duke of Cornwall, Earl of Chester. Within a few years he was no figurehead, but a working soldier, given charge of the war in Wales while older men managed the daily business around him, and then, as he grew, taking that business into his own hands. There was no sheltered boyhood behind him, and no Eastcheap. There was a border at war and a dynasty not yet sure of its ground. The proof came early and in blood. In the summer of 1403, the Percys, the great northern house of Northumberland, and his son, the celebrated soldier remembered as Hotspur, the very men whose swords had helped put Henry's father on the throne, turned against him and rose in arms. The royal army and the rebels met near Shrewsbury on the 21st of July. Prince Henry, 16 years old, held a command in the king's line. It was no skirmish. It was among the bloodiest battles fought on English soil in that century, a close and merciless struggle between 2 armies of English archers who each knew precisely how to kill the other, and for a time the day hung in the balance, and the whole Lancastrian venture with it. It was decided only when Hotspur was killed in the press, and the rebellion, leaderless, broke. Long before it broke, an arrow found the prince. It struck him in the face, entering on the left side beside the nose and driving deep. The surgeon who later treated him reckoned the head had lodged some 6 inches fast in the bone toward the back of the skull. By any ordinary reckoning, it was a mortal wound and a hideous one. That the boy is said to have stayed on the field rather than be carried from it only sharpened the peril, for an arrowhead buried in the skull could not simply be drawn out. The barbs would tear on the way out as they had going in, and a wound beneath the eye was an open door to the infection that killed most men. It did not kill at once. He was saved by a royal surgeon named John Bradmore, and by a piece of grim ingenuity. Bradmore first kept the wound open and clean, working into it over several days a succession of probes made from the pith of an elder, wrapped in linen and soaked in honey, each a little larger than the last, until he had opened a path to the depth where the iron lay. Then he had made an instrument of his own devising, a pair of slender hollow tongs worked by a screw, which he eased into the socket of the buried arrowhead, tightened until it gripped, and by slow turns drew the head out. He washed the raw channel with wine, dressed it with ointments, and against all likelihood the prince healed. He carried the mark of it for the rest of his life. That scar may account for one of the most familiar images in English history. The enduring likenesses of Henry V show him not full face but in strict profile, and it has long been supposed that the pose was chosen to keep the wounded side of his face from view. The surviving portrait is a later copy of a lost original, and the claim cannot be proved. The profile was also in that age simply a fashion borrowed from coins and from Italian painting. But the instinct behind the story fits the man the record shows, one who understood the management of his own image and who had earned his disfigurement not in a tavern brawl but in the front rank of a battle at 16. That, and not Eastcheap, was the true school of the young prince, an arrow in the face and a surgeon's screw. What the sources do show of him, they show consistently. The prince who emerges from the letters and the accounts is grave beyond his years, hard-working, careful with money, and exact in matters of religion long before he was king. Those who knew the court remembered not a reveler but a soldier, watchful, controlled, sparing of himself in nothing. If there had been any real wildness in him, it would have left its mark in the one place a wild man's affairs always do, in the records of debts, scandals, and disorder that follow such a life, and the record is silent. The wastrel is missing from precisely the place a wastrel could not have hidden. His true apprenticeship went on for the better part of a decade in Wales. There the charismatic Owain Glyndwr had raised a rebellion that would smoulder for 10 years and, at its height, threatened to tear Wales out of English hands altogether. It was not a war of banners and set-piece battles, but of attrition, of burned country and denied harvests, of raids that came out of the mountains and vanished into them again, and of the slow reduction of castles one by one. As the king's lieutenant in Wales, the prince learned the hard, unglamorous trade that would define him: how to hold an army together and fed in hostile country, how to press a siege through the long grind of hunger and cold, how to keep the loyalty of men no better off than himself. He directed the reduction of the last great rebel strongholds, Aberystwyth and Harlech, in sieges that dragged across seasons and were settled by guns and starvation rather than by valor. Those years made him more than a soldier. They made him, while still very young, a manager of men and money on a large scale, bargaining for the wages of garrisons, wringing supplies from a reluctant treasury, learning the plain and brutal truth that an army unpaid and unfed dissolves whatever the courage of its captains. He came out of the Welsh War with a settled contempt for the gap between chivalric display and the grinding reality of a campaign, and with the first workings of the administrative machine he would one day turn upon the whole of France. It was here, and not on any field of chivalry, that Henry learned that wars are won by method, by the patient, remorseless application of force over years, and it was a lesson he never unlearned. The closing years of his father's reign taught him something colder still: the danger of standing too near a frightened king, even one's own father. Henry IV was failing, worn by a wasting and disfiguring illness that his enemies were quick to call the visible judgment of God upon a usurper. As the king weakened, his able son was drawn to the center of government, and for a stretch across 1410 and 1411, the prince and his allies, chief among them his kinsman, the Bishop Henry Beaufort, effectively governed through the royal council. They pressed their own line in policy, favoring the Duke of Burgundy in the widening quarrels of France. To a sick and suspicious king, it looked less like service than like a son grown impatient for his throne, and there were whispers that the prince's friends had urged the old man to give up the crown while he lived. Late in 1411, Henry IV struck back, dismissing his son from the council and taking the government again into his own hands. For a time, father and son were estranged, and the court was thick with mistrust. The prince found it necessary to come to his father in person to answer the charge that he sought the crown before its time. They were reconciled before the end, but the friction had been real and bitter, a contest over power and policy between a dying father and a son unmistakably ready to rule. Later ages could not resist dressing that quarrel in theatre, the scenes beloved of the chroniclers and the stage, of the prince lifting the crown from beside his sleeping father or kneeling in penitent tears to be forgiven, are moral tableaux added long after the fact. The documented truth is plainer and harder, a capable heir and a fading jealous king circling one another over a realm neither could afford to lose. This is why the legend of the Wild Prince reformed overnight cannot survive the record. There was no sudden transformation because none was needed. The reformed rake story was built afterwards by men who wanted the drama of a soul remade, and who found in a fictional knight and an imagined tavern a better tale than the true one. The young man who came to the throne in the spring of 1413 had not been squandering his youth in Eastcheap. He had been shot in the face at 16 and had lived. He had spent a decade at siege work in the Welsh mountains. He had governed a kingdom's council and been cast out of it by his own father. He arrived at the crown already made, disciplined, guarded, devout, and thoroughly blooded, and he turned that hardened nature at once upon the work of being king. What that work would look like, and the God in whose name he meant to do it, would become clear within months of his accession. The crown came to Henry on the 20th of March, 1413, when his father died in the abbot's lodging at Westminster in the chamber called Jerusalem. Legend would make that moment a threshold, the reckless prince stepping across it transformed, the tavern shut behind him forever. It was nothing of the kind. There was no wastrel to reform, and so there was no reformation. What the record shows instead is a change of degree, not of nature. A man already cold, already methodical, already devout, who now turned the whole force of that austere and singular temperament upon the business of ruling. He did not put away a wild life. He intensified the only life he had ever led. And yet the legend was not spun from nothing. There was a change in Henry when he became king, and men remarked on it, but it was a change of bearing, not of soul. The contemporaries noted that from the day of his accession he put on a new gravity, setting a distance between himself and the looser companions of his household, giving himself wholly to the dignity of the office and suffering no frivolity near the throne. It was the natural hardening of a serious man taking up the greatest responsibility of his life. Later writers, reaching for a better story, magnified that sober settling into a miracle of the spirit. The wastrel struck sober in a single night, and so a real and modest truth became the false and famous one. That same seriousness showed in the way he governed. Henry ruled with a firm and even hand, restoring to the crown an authority his father's anxious reign had let slip, and winning from a weary parliament a trust his father had never quite commanded. He was known for a stern and impartial justice, hard but not capricious, and for a personal probity that his subjects, weary of decades of faction and misrule, found reassuring. It was the rule of a man who believed that order itself was a form of piety and disorder a kind of sin. To govern well was, for Henry, to do God's work, and a king doing God's work could permit himself very little softness, in himself or in anyone else. He came to the throne carrying an inheritance that was also a wound. His father had taken the crown by force from the anointed Richard II, and Richard had died in captivity soon after, almost certainly murdered. The House of Lancaster had never washed that stain away, and Henry knew it followed him, knew that in the eyes of many, at home and abroad, a crown seized in usurpation and stained with a king's death could bring no blessing on the line that wore it. Before he could ask God's favor for anything else, he set about, in the most public way he could contrive, to make amends for the sin that had made his family kings. Within months of his accession, he performed the most calculated and the most sincere act of atonement of his reign. He brought Richard II home. The murdered king had been buried without honor in a friary at King's Langley, out of sight and half forgotten. Henry had the body exhumed and carried in solemn procession to Westminster Abbey and laid it in the splendid tomb that Richard had built there years before for himself and his first queen, Anne of Bohemia. It was an act of piety and an act of policy in the same breath. It honored the dead king his own family had destroyed. It answered the pretenders who still whispered that Richard lived in hiding and would one day return by showing the nation his corpse and closing the grave over it. And it announced that the age of usurpation was over and the crown restored to the path of lawful, God-given authority. Henry meant it, and it served him, and the two were seldom separate in anything he did. The reburial was of a piece with all his early kingship. With deliberate care he set out to heal the enmities his father's insecure reign had left raw. He restored to their inheritances the sons of men who had died fighting the Lancastrians, among them the young heir of Hotspur, of the very Percy family that had nearly killed him at Shrewsbury, brought back from exile in Scotland and restored to the earldom of Northumberland. He drew old rivals into his service and before long into his war. It was generosity and it was strategy. A king who meant to lead a united England into France could leave no great wound bleeding at his back. The atonement for Richard and the mending of old quarrels were two faces of one design, but to make the Lancastrian crown at last look less like a prize seized and more like a trust rightly held. For his piety was not a soft thing, and it did not incline him to mercy. It was the hardest thing about him. Henry's religion was total and exact. He heard Mass daily, kept long hours at prayer, lived with a chastity and austerity that startled a worldly court, and held himself and those around him to a discipline that was very nearly monastic. He gave that devotion stone and endowment as well as time. In the very year he would sail for France, he founded two great religious houses on the Thames near his manor at Sheen, a monastery of the strict Brigittine order at Sion, and a charter house of the silent, ascetic Carthusians, so that in them, day and night, monks and nuns would pray for his soul and for his house forever. This was not the conventional piety of a medieval king performing its expected forms. It was the engine of the man, and it worked upon him in a way the hero legend never quite admits. Henry did not believe merely that he served God. He believed that God worked through him, that he was an instrument raised up for a purpose, and that his cause was therefore God's cause. Such a faith does not soften a ruler, it arms him. If the king's will and God's will were one, then to resist the king was not merely rebellion but sin. Those who stood against him stood against heaven and might be dealt with accordingly. The same conviction that made Henry, just by the stern measure of his age, tireless, honest in judgment, careful of good order, made him capable of terrible things and left him serenely certain while he did them. The devotion and the ruthlessness were not at war in him. They were the same quality, turned to different work. Those who wrote of Henry in his own time reached again and again for the same language. The near-contemporary account set down by a priest who followed his army describes a king grave beyond his years, sparing of words, exact in justice, and wholly persuaded that God stood with England's cause. It reports victory after victory as the plain work of divine favor, and records that the king himself forbade his men to boast of what English arms had done, ascribing all of it to God. Such writers must be read with care, for they wrote to praise. But the portrait is too consistent to be mere invention. A ruler who genuinely believed himself the servant of a purpose larger than his own ambition, and who drew from that belief not humility but an immense and dangerous strength. The steel in that faith was tested before he ever reached France, and the test came from within his own family. In the summer of 1415, with his army mustering on the south coast and his fleet all but ready to sail, a conspiracy was uncovered at Southampton. 3 men stood at its heart: Richard, Earl of Cambridge, the king's own cousin, Sir Thomas Grey of Heaton, and, most woundingly, Henry, Lord Scrope of Masham, who had been among the king's most trusted intimates and companions. Their plan was to destroy Henry on the eve of his great enterprise and set on the throne in his place Edmund Mortimer, Earl of March, in whom some saw a claim to the crown older and cleaner than Lancaster's own. The plot reached, in other words, back to the same unhealed question that had shadowed Henry all his life. By what right did his family wear the crown at all? It was Mortimer himself, the man they meant to make king, who lost his nerve and revealed the conspiracy to Henry. What followed showed the realm exactly what kind of king it now had. There was no hesitation and none of the drawn-out maneuvering that had kept his father's reign in perpetual anxiety. The conspirators were seized, tried, condemned, and put to death within days. Grey first, and then Scrope and Cambridge beheaded outside the Southampton Gate in the first week of August. Henry did not spare his cousin, and he did not spare the friend who had betrayed him. The message to the nobility of England, delivered as the whole army stood waiting to embark, could not have been plainer. The king's authority was absolute because it rested on a mandate from God, and any hand raised against it, however close, would be struck off without delay and without mercy. There is a detail the legend prefers to forget. The Earl of Cambridge, beheaded at Southampton in 1415, left a young son, Richard, who would grow up to be Duke of York and whose own descendants would one day tear the crown from Henry's line in the long civil wars we call the Wars of the Roses. The stain the Lancastrians could not scrub away would return, in time, through the very blood Henry shed to keep it down. But that lay far in the future, and Henry could not have seen it, for now there was only a king who had buried the ghost of Richard II, purged the traitors from his own household, and bound his throne, his conscience, and his coming war into a single seamless certainty. This, then, was the man who stood ready in the late summer of 1415 to carry that certainty across the sea. He did not see, in the fractured kingdom of France, a neighbor to be robbed or a prize to be won merely for glory's sake. He saw a right withheld and a duty owed to his ancestors and to the God whose instrument he believed himself to be. He had made himself, at home, into something formidable and cold, a ruler whose faith justified rather than restrained him, and who had already shown that he would spend the lives even of his own kin to keep his house secure. What he would do to strangers in a country he was certain was lawfully his, the coming years would reveal. First, though, that same relentless faith had turned its attention upon enemies nearer at hand, not men who threatened the king's crown, but men who threatened, as he saw it, God's own church. The faith that made Henry a formidable king had another face, and it showed itself first not in France but at home, in the fires he lit beneath his own subjects. To Henry, the safety of the realm and the purity of its religion were the same thing. A kingdom that tolerated false belief was a kingdom inviting the anger of God, and a usurper's house, already short of divine credit, could afford that anger least of all. Where his enemies were heretics, the king's duty and the king's interest pointed the same way, toward the stake. The heresy that alarmed the age was Lollardy. Its root was the teaching of John Wycliffe, an Oxford theologian of the previous century who had attacked the wealth and worldly power of the church, questioned the doctrine that the priest's words turned bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ, and held that scripture, put into English so that ordinary men might read it for themselves, was a higher authority than pope or prelate. To the reformers, these were matters of conscience and of the plain word of God. To the church and the crown, they were poison. A denial of the priesthood, of the sacraments, of the whole visible order by which God's authority was held to descend through the church to the king and down to the least of his subjects, and heresy was feared as the seed of revolt. Men remembered the great rising of the peasants a generation before. They were quick to link any challenge to the church with a challenge to all degree and rule, and to see in the quiet Lollard reader of an English Bible the beginnings of a world turned upside down. The movement had spread further than the authorities liked. It had taken root, not only among craftsmen and small men in the towns, but among a number of gentlemen and knights, some of them soldiers of standing, who sheltered its preachers and copied and passed its books. That was what made it dangerous in the eyes of the crown. Not the poor tailor with his forbidden gospel, but the armed and landed man who thought as he did. And the law had already given the fear its instrument. In 1401, under Henry's father, the statute known by its Latin name, De Heretico Comburendo, on the burning of heretics, had for the first time made obstinate heresy a crime to be punished by fire, and a Lollard priest had gone to the flames that same year. The statute made the burning of the unrepentant not an act of private cruelty but a solemn duty of the crown, and the enforcement of it a test of a king's own faith. Henry did not flinch from that test. He had shown as much before he ever wore the crown. In 1410, while he was still Prince of Wales, a Lollard tailor named John Badby was condemned for denying that the bread of the Mass became the body of Christ and brought to Smithfield to be burned. The prince came to watch, and when the fire was already lit and the man's cries rose from the barrel in which he stood, Henry ordered the flames dragged back. He offered Badby his life, a full pardon, and even a pension from the crown, if only he would recant and return to the church. The scorched man refused. And so the prince, having done what he plainly believed was his Christian duty in offering mercy, gave the order to build the fire again, and Badby died in it. The scene holds the whole of Henry in miniature: the sincere, almost tender wish to save a soul, and the perfect pitiless readiness to destroy the body once the soul would not be saved. Nowhere did that terrible consistency cost him more than in the case of Sir John Oldcastle. Oldcastle was no obscure fanatic. He was a distinguished soldier who had risen in the Welsh wars, a lord by his marriage, Lord Cobham, and for years a friend and comrade in arms of Henry himself, a man of the prince's own circle who had shared the hardships of the camp and the dangers of the field. He was also, and openly, a convinced Lollard, a protector of their preachers, a keeper of their books, a man who had brought the new faith into the heart of the king's own affinity. In him the two worlds of Henry's life met head-on, the loyalty owed to an old companion, and the duty owed, as the king saw it, to God. The chronicles record that Henry tried and tried hard to save him, not his life only but his soul, urging him in person to abandon his beliefs and return to the church, putting off the day of reckoning in the hope that his friend would yield. It is a striking picture, if the chroniclers have it right, the cold, certain king pleading with the one old comrade whose conscience would not bend to his. But Oldcastle proved as immovable in his faith as Henry was in his duty, and the king's patience, governed by the iron clock of his convictions, at last ran out. Oldcastle was brought before the Archbishop of Canterbury, examined and condemned as a heretic. He was granted 40 days to reconsider, and shut in the Tower of London. Before the days were out, he escaped. He did not slip quietly into exile. Late in 1413 and into the new year, he became the figurehead of a Lollard rising, a plan, desperate and ill-kept, to gather the faithful outside London, seize the king and his brothers, and overturn the order of church and realm together. But Henry was warned. On a January night in 1414, his men were waiting in the darkness of St. Giles's Fields as the rebels came to their muster, and the rising was broken almost before it could begin. Those taken were put to death as heretics and traitors both, some hanged, some burned. To the king it was proof of everything he had already believed, that heresy and treason were finally one thing, that the man who defied the church would in the end defy the crown, and that mercy shown to either was a peril to both. In the wake of the rising, the machinery of persecution was tightened further. A statute of 1414 bound the secular officers of the realm, the sheriffs and the justices, to seek out heretics and deliver them to the church for judgment, so that the hunt for false belief became a standing duty of the ordinary government of England, not merely the business of bishops. Oldcastle himself, meanwhile, had slipped the net, and he was pursued for nearly 4 years, a fugitive moving through the wilder country of the Welsh borders, while the state closed slowly around him. He was taken at last, badly hurt, in the autumn of 1417, and carried to London. There was no room left for the old affection, if affection it had ever been. He was brought before Parliament, condemned as a convicted heretic and a proven traitor, and put to death in December of 1417 in the doubled form his two offences were held to deserve. He was hanged, and the gallows and the man upon it were burned together. So ended a soldier of the king's own youth, not in comedy, but in the fire. It is here that history collides most strangely with the stage. When Shakespeare first set the fat, cowardly, wine-soaked knight of his tavern scenes upon the boards, he gave him the name of Sir John Oldcastle. Oldcastle's descendants, men of rank in a later reign, protested at the mockery of their martyred ancestor, and the playwright changed the name to Falstaff, adding at the end of one play the pointed note that Oldcastle had died a martyr and that this was not the man. And so the real Oldcastle, a soldier of hard and austere conviction who chose the fire rather than deny what he believed, passed into the national memory turned upside down as the very emblem of drunken cowardice and easy vice. The beloved comic knight of the tavern is a slander grown famous. The truth buried beneath him is a man Henry burned. The point must be held steadily because it is the darkest thing about Henry's faith and the easiest to soften. He did not burn Oldcastle or Badby or the rest out of cruelty or cynicism or a mere lust for power. He burned them because he believed that heresy damned the soul and endangered the realm, that the church's judgment was God's judgment, and that a king who let the infection spread betrayed both his people and his God. A tyrant who kills for advantage is a familiar and almost comprehensible thing. Henry is something colder and stranger, a man good by the fierce lights of his age, doing what he was wholly certain was right, and finding in his sincere devotion not a reason for mercy, but a license for the fire. The burnings themselves were not many. England never saw the mass fires of some of the continental persecutions, but that was never the point. A handful of deaths, staged in public and sanctioned by the highest authority in the land, were meant to teach a lesson to thousands, and they did. Under Henry, the Lollards were driven underground, their gentry sympathizers cowed into silence or conformity, their preachers scattered, their movement broken as an open force for 100 years. It was, by the measures of statecraft, a complete success, a small deliberate application of terror that bought a great and lasting quiet. That the quiet was purchased with the bodies of men whose only offense was to believe the wrong things about bread and wine was, to the king, no argument against it at all. By such means, the young king made his realm, in the years before the Great War, exactly what he believed a Christian kingdom should be: obedient, orthodox, and cleansed. He had silenced the dissenters and shown the price of dissent. But the unity he had forged at home was, to Henry's mind, only the ground on which a far larger design would be built. The stain of his father's usurpation could not be washed out within England's borders alone. The whispers about Richard II and the stolen crown would be silenced for good only by a triumph so vast and so plainly blessed by God that no man could doubt where heaven's favor lay. He looked across the Channel to a France collapsing into its own madness, and he saw not a neighbor but a destiny. The same faith that had already taught him to watch an old friend burn was about to send him abroad as the soldier of God, and the price of that faith, paid at home in the Lollard fires, would be paid on the continent by the uncounted thousands who stood in his way. From the first days of his reign, Henry's gaze was fixed across the Channel. The work at home, the atonement for Richard II, the purging of heresy and treason, was in a sense a clearing of the ground. The thing he meant to build upon it was a war, the greatest enterprise an English king could attempt, the pursuit of the crown of France itself. He was 26 years old when he came to the throne, and he brought to the project the same cold, exact, tireless temper he brought to everything. He did not want a raid or a season's plunder or a quarrel patched up with a truce and a marriage. He wanted a kingdom. The claim was old enough to have hardened into a fiction of state. 3 generations before, Edward III had declared himself the rightful king of France through his mother, a daughter of the French royal house. The French had answered that by their law no crown could pass through the female line, and out of that quarrel had grown the long, intermittent war that had already run on and off for the better part of a century. In the years between, English kings had used the claim less as a serious title than as a bargaining piece and a pretext for the chevauchée, the swift, destructive raid that burned the French countryside, filled English purses, and humbled the Valois kings without ever seeking to unseat them. Henry meant to do what no English king had truly attempted. He meant to press the claim to the letter and to keep what he took. Later ages gave the war a livelier cause. The story goes that the French Dauphin, to mock the young king as a frivolous boy, sent him a gift of tennis balls, and that Henry, stung to fury, turned the insult into a war. It is a good story and a false one, a flourish added by chroniclers and made immortal on the stage. Henry needed no insult and waited for none. The causes of his war were cold and long considered. A foreign triumph would bind a divided England behind its uncertain dynasty. It would drown the whispers about Richard II and the stolen crown beneath the noise of victory. It would give the House of Lancaster the one thing it had never possessed, the unanswerable legitimacy of a great and God-blessed success. The war, in short, was the answer to the question that had shadowed his family since 1399. and Henry had been preparing it in the treasury and the dockyard as much as in his own mind since long before his father was cold, and there was opportunity such as no English king had ever been offered, for France was tearing itself apart. Its king, Charles VI, had for more than 20 years been subject to fits of devastating madness, long spells in which he did not know his own wife or children, believed himself made of glass and in danger of shattering at a touch, and could rule nothing at all. Around the empty place where a king should have been, the great princes of France had fallen to open war among themselves. The murder of the king's brother, the Duke of Orleans, cut down in a Paris street in 1407 at the order of his cousin the Duke of Burgundy, had split the kingdom into two armed and hate-filled camps, Burgundians and Armagnacs, who loathed each other far more than they feared any foreigner. They fought for control of the mad king and his capital, butchered one another's followers in the streets, and laid waste the country that lay between them. France in these years was less a nation to be conquered than a nation already devouring itself, and Henry watched it with the patience of a man who knew that a house divided will, in time, open its own doors. He did more than watch. He treated with both factions at once, holding out his friendship to Burgundy and to Armagnac in turn, learning their weaknesses, keeping each uncertain whether the English king would fall upon it or upon its rival, and through his ambassadors he pressed France with demands pitched deliberately at the edge of the impossible. He asked at the least for the vast lands his ancestors had once held across France, Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and the full and sovereign possession of Aquitaine, together with the hand of Charles' daughter Catherine, and a dowry so enormous it would have beggared the French treasury. At the most he asked for the crown of France entire. He did not expect these terms to be granted, and it is doubtful he wished them to be. Every French refusal was another stone in the wall of justification he was building, proof to his own parliament and people and to his own conscience that he had sought his right by peaceful means and been denied, and that the war to come was therefore a just one, forced upon a patient and reasonable king. The embassies went back and forth for the better part of 2 years, and Henry conducted them with the same patience he gave to everything. His envoys crossed to France with their impossible lists. The French, playing for time and hampered by their own divisions, answered with counter-offers that crept slowly upward. The hand of Catherine, a great sum in dowry, the restoration of some of the disputed lands, but never far enough and never fast enough to close the gap he had deliberately opened. In the spring of 1415 he sent a last and grand embassy to Paris, and when it came home with nothing he chose to call satisfaction, he laid the failure of peace before his council and his parliament, and had them declare the fault to be France's. Stone by stone, refusal by refusal, he had built the unassailable position of a wronged man reaching at last for the sword. Behind the diplomacy, the real work went forward, the raising of a war machine of a scale and method England had not seen. This was no feudal summons of grudging lords. Henry built his army by contract, sealing indentures with captains great and small who undertook, for agreed wages, to bring so many men-at-arms and so many mounted archers to the muster, equipped and ready, their numbers checked man by man, against the rolls. The archers, the longbowmen who were England's one decisive advantage in the field, he gathered in their thousands and bound to the same disciplined terms, turning what had once been a seasonal levy towards something nearer a paid, professional force. He needed ships to carry this host, and having too few of his own, he arrested merchantmen in every port and hired vessels from the Low Countries, alongside the great royal ships, the Trinity Royal and the Holy Ghost, that were the pride of his fleet. He ordered guns cast, the heavy bombards that could hurl a stone great enough to break a wall, and had arrows made and stored by the 100,000, with bowstrings, gunstones, salt meat, biscuit, and all the mountainous, unglamorous freight of a campaign meant not to raid, but to stay. None of it was cheap, and the getting of the money was itself a feat of will. Henry pawned the crown jewels, borrowed heavily from his wealthy kinsman the bishop and from the merchants of London, and wrung subsidies from a parliament he had carefully brought to his side, so that the whole apparatus of the English state, its ports, its forests, its smiths and fletchers and victuallers, its taxpayers, was bent for months toward the single end of putting an army across the sea. It was an act of organization as much as of ambition, and it revealed the truest thing about him, that he made war not as an adventurer but as an administrator, cold-eyed and complete, who left as little as possible to chance or to God, even in a cause he was certain God had ordained. For the space of that summer, the whole of southern England became a staging ground for the invasion. The roads were choked with carts of arrows and salt meat. The forests gave up their yew and their timber. Smiths, fletchers, coopers, and shipwrights labored to the crown's account, and men came in from every shire to the muster, drawn by the wages, by the promise of plunder, and by the pull of a young king who plainly meant to win. It was the largest and best-ordered effort of its kind that England had made in living memory, and it was bent from end to end upon a single throw of the dice. For the war was, in his own mind, as much a matter of religion as of policy, and here again the piety hardened rather than softened. Henry seems genuinely to have believed that his claim was a right unjustly withheld from his forefathers, and that to enforce it was to serve God's justice as well as his own honor. He represented the coming invasion not as ambition but as duty, a wrong to be righted, a trust to be redeemed, and he demanded of his soldiers a conduct fit for a holy work, issuing strict ordinances against blasphemy, against the plundering of churches, against the abuse of women and of priests. That the same holy work would kill uncounted thousands and lay whole provinces waste did not trouble the logic, for in that logic the blood was the price of a divine reckoning long overdue. The war was not a sin to be regretted, it was a debt to be collected, in God's name. By the summer of 1415 the machine was built and the pretense of negotiation exhausted. The south coast filled with men and horses and stores. The port of Southampton became a forest of masts as the great host was loaded into the ships. The last treachery at home, the conspiracy of nobles who would have killed the king and set another in his place, had already been uncovered and answered with the axe, and no shadow of it was allowed to delay the enterprise. Henry moved among the preparations with his usual restless exactness, checking and counting, and waited for the wind. He was 28 and would turn 29 within a few weeks as he made ready to carry an army of perhaps 10,000 to 12,000 fighting men into a kingdom several times the size of his own, a kingdom broken, divided, and, he was wholly certain, lawfully his. When the wind at last came fair in the middle of August, the fleet stood out to sea, and the coast of England fell away behind a king who believed he sailed to claim an inheritance and to prove, on the largest stage in the world, that God was on the side of the House of Lancaster. Ahead of him lay the coast of Normandy and a walled port at the mouth of the Seine that would be the first to learn the true cost of his ambition. The fleet that carried Henry's army out of the Solent in the middle of August 1415 was the instrument of years of patient preparation, hundreds of ships bearing an army raised by contract and paid in coin, with its guns, its horses, and its mountains of stores. Where earlier English kings had come to France to raid and be gone, Henry came to conquer and to hold, and he approached even the crossing with the cold exactness of a man balancing a ledger. On the 13th and 14th of August, the ships came to anchor off the mouth of the Seine, and the army began to disembark on the shingle below the chalk cliffs, a few miles from its first objective, the fortified port of Harfleur. Harfleur was worth the taking. It stood at the mouth of the Seine, the river road that led to Rouen and on to Paris. It was a strong walled town with a good harbor, and from it French ships had long preyed on English shipping and raided the English coast. Henry wanted it as a gate into Normandy and a base he could hold and supply from the sea, a second Calais, an English foothold driven into French soil. He drew his army around it, summoned it in due form to open its gates to its lawful lord, and, when the garrison and its determined captains refused, he settled down to reduce it by the slow, certain methods he trusted above all others. This is the siege that Shakespeare, writing nearly 2 centuries later, turned into the most famous cry of leadership in the language. Once more unto the breach, dear friends, once more, the king flung at the head of his men into the gap in the wall. It is worth saying plainly that the speech is an invention. There was no such moment and no such words. The real siege of Harfleur was not a matter of heroic charges but of engineering and attrition. Henry ringed the town, cut it off by land and by water, and set his great guns to battering the walls and gate towers day after day, while his miners dug beneath the defenses to bring them down from below. The defenders answered with skill and courage of their own, repairing by night the breaches the guns opened by day, digging countermines against the English tunnels, flooding the low ground to foul the approaches. It was a grinding, methodical, unspectacular business, and it was slow. And slowness, in that place and that season, was the deadliest enemy Henry faced. The guns were the heart of the siege, and they were something still half new in the English way of war. Henry had brought with him great bombards, squat, enormous cannon of iron and bronze that threw stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, and he set them against the gate towers and walls with a patience that never flagged. Each was a labor in itself, hauled into place, bedded, loaded, fired only a handful of times a day, then cooled and fired again, while the stone shot cracked the masonry and brought the towers down in slow ruin. Around them the older arts of the siege went on, the mines creeping toward the foundations, the assaults on the outworks, the endless watch against a sally from the gates. It was war as engineering and as bookkeeping, exactly the war Henry understood best, and it was working. But it was slow, and time was the one supply he could not stockpile. For while the siege dragged on, the army began to die, not on the walls but in its own camp. Henry had pitched his host on low, marshy ground beside the estuary, in the heat at the end of summer, with foul water and the filth of thousands of men and animals corrupting what little there was. Into that ground came dysentery, the disease the soldiers called the bloody flux, a squalid, agonizing, degrading killer that emptied a man of his strength and his dignity together and left him dead in his own waste within days. It moved through the camp and could not be checked. Men who had crossed the sea in health and in armor were reduced to wasted skeletons in a fortnight. Before the English had fought a single battle in the open field, the flux was killing them by the hundred and doing to Henry's army what the French had not yet managed to do at all. It took the great as readily as the common. Richard Courtenay, the Bishop of Norwich, a scholar and a close friend of the king, died of it. So did the Earl of Suffolk. The king's own brother, the Duke of Clarence, and other lords fell so ill they had to be carried aboard ship and sent home, and some of them died on the voyage or soon after they reached England. The chronicles set the toll down soberly, and it was ruinous. By the time Harfleur fell, thousands of the men who had sailed with such careful preparation were dead or too sick to lift a weapon, and thousands more were being shipped back across the channel to recover or to die as God pleased. The great machine had met an enemy its ledgers had not reckoned with, and against that enemy its discipline and its guns were of no use whatever. By some reckonings, barely half the army that had landed in August was still fit to march by the end of September. The chronicles differ, as they always do, on the exact numbers, and medieval counts of the dead and the dying are rarely to be trusted, but no source pretends the loss was anything but crippling. The force Henry had assembled with such care over 2 years, the professional army, the great siege train, the mountains of stores, had been built to conquer a kingdom. Before it had marched a single mile inland, disease had reduced it to something that could barely hold what it had already taken. Henry himself, by every account, was tireless through it all, moving among the works, holding his men to their duty, keeping the siege pressed despite the dying, and giving himself, as always, to long and rigid prayer. He appears to have regarded the pestilence not as a defeat, but as a trial, a purgatory the English must pass through to deserve the victory he was certain God intended for them, and whatever he felt, he did not let it turn him from his purpose. The town, for its part, had held out in the hope of relief from the armies of the French king, but France was too consumed by its own quarrels to save one of its ports, and no relief came. Starved, battered, its walls breached, and its defenders worn to exhaustion, Harfleur at last sought terms. If no army came to raise the siege by an appointed day, it would surrender. None came. On the 22nd of September the town gave itself up. Henry took possession with a display of the piety that governed him, giving solemn thanks for the victory. He is said to have gone to the church on foot and unshod to render it. His treatment of the town itself was harder, and it pointed toward the future. The wealthier citizens and the soldiers of the garrison were held for ransom or released upon their oaths. But a great part of the poorer inhabitants, those the town could not ransom and the king had no use for, were driven out of Harfleur altogether and sent destitute into France, so that the port might be emptied of its French people and resettled with English colonists as a lasting English possession. It was done coldly, as policy, without cruelty and without pity alike, and it was a small first showing of a pattern that would reveal its full and terrible shape 3 years later beneath the walls of Rouen, a king who would move the helpless out of his path by cold decision when they stood between him and what he meant to have. The defense had been stubborn and honorable. Its commander Raoul de Gaucourt had held on long past any real hope of relief, and the surrender, when it came, was a genuine triumph. But it was also a warning of how the whole war would go. Harfleur was one town, and the winning of it had taken more than a month and the greater part of an army. France held 100 such towns. If each was to be reduced at such a price in time, in men and in disease, then the conquest of a kingdom would be the work not of a single campaign but of a lifetime, a truth that would prove, in the years to come, exactly as grim as it sounds. The taking of Harfleur had cost far more than Henry can have intended, and it left him in a hard place. The campaigning season was all but spent. The town he had won needed a strong garrison he could ill afford to leave behind, and the army that was to have conquered France was hollowed out, perhaps halved, by disease. The prudent course, the one his council pressed upon him, was plain enough. Hold Harfleur, put the sick aboard ship, and sail the remnant home to England to recover and return in strength another year. By any sober military reckoning it was the right decision, and his commanders urged it on him. Henry would not take it. To have crossed the sea with such preparation and such high purpose, and then to steal home having gained a single battered port at so terrible a price, would look to all the world, to the doubters in France, to the doubters in England, to the whispering enemies of his house, like failure and like weakness, the very things his whole reign had been built to disprove. So he chose a course that defied prudence. He would march his diminished army overland, more than 100 miles through hostile country, to the safety of English-held Calais. A deliberate progress through a land he claimed as his own, meant to show that the King of England could go where he pleased in his kingdom of France and that none dared stop him. He knew the French were mustering a great army to his south and east. Whether he expected to slip past them or, if forced, to give battle, the sources do not let us say for certain, and it may be that he had not wholly decided himself. What is certain is that he understood the risk and accepted it, trusting to discipline, to the coming of winter, and to the God he believed had carried him this far. In the second week of October, he left a garrison in Harfleur, turned his back upon the sea, and led his sick and shrunken army north into the autumn rains, toward the swollen rivers and the gathering host, and a field near a village called Agincourt. The army that filed out of Harfleur in the second week of October 1415 was not the army that had sailed from England 2 months before. It had crossed the Channel to conquer a kingdom. It left a single battered port as a shrunken, sickly remnant. The siege had devoured the campaigning season, and a great part of the men, most of them lost not to French arms but to the bloody flux that had turned the low marshy camp into a place of dying. A garrison had to be left behind to hold what had been so dearly bought. What remained to march north, the chroniclers' figures differ, but perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 fighting men, the overwhelming majority of them archers, was underfed, footsore, and in many cases still hollow from disease. By every ordinary reckoning of war, the sensible course was the one Henry's own commanders pressed upon him. Garrison the town, ship the survivors home, and return in strength in a better season. Henry would not have it. He resolved instead to march his diminished force overland to Calais, the English-held enclave more than 150 miles to the northeast, through open country that belonged to the enemy. The decision has been read ever since as either recklessness or iron nerve, and it was probably both. To sail home, having taken one port at so ruinous a price, would look, to a watching France and a doubtful England, like a defeat dressed as a victory, and Henry, the son of a usurper, could afford no appearance of weakness. The march was to be a statement that an English king could walk through the heart of France and dare its chivalry to stop him. He carried, by most accounts, only a week or so of rations, gambling that he could reach Calais before hunger and the French together ran him down. The reality was a grim, cold trudge that bore no resemblance to the adventure of later legend. Autumn rain fell without relief, and the tracks of northern France dissolved into clinging mud that sucked at boots and slowed the baggage to a crawl. The men were on short commons from the first days and soon on almost nothing. The flux still moved through the ranks, and stragglers who fell out of the column were killed by the country people or by the enemy shadowing its flanks. For the French had no intention of meeting Henry in open battle while hunger and distance did their work for them. They raised a great host and moved to cut him off, shadowing the English column, garrisoning the towns in its path, and, most dangerous of all, holding the crossings of the river Somme. That river became the trap's first jaw. Henry had meant to ford the Somme near its mouth, at the tidal crossing of Blanchetaque, where Edward III had passed before Crécy 2 generations earlier. He found the ford guarded and its approaches thick with sharpened stakes. There was nothing for it but to turn away from the coast and march up the south bank, deeper and deeper inland, hunting for a bridge or a ford the French had not broken or blocked. Day after day, the army moved in the wrong direction, away from Calais and safety, past Amiens and on toward Péronne, the men weakening and the enemy keeping pace along the far bank. Only after some 60 miles of this did the English at last find undefended fords near Betancourt and Voyenne, and cross on the 19th of October, wading and bridging the marsh as best they could. They were over the Somme, but they were also spent, far from the sea, and now certain that a French army much larger than their own lay somewhere ahead. The figures tell their own grim story. A march planned for perhaps 8 days and something over 100 miles had become, through the long detour up the Somme, a trek of 250 miles or more that consumed the better part of 3 weeks. The men who waded across near Betancourt had been on the road soaked through and hungry since the beginning of the month. Many still suffered the flux, marching in their own filth, too weak to do more than stumble forward. The horses were failing, the nights had turned bitter. What held the column together was not the hope of glory, but the plain knowledge that a straggler was a dead man, and that the only road out of France ran through whatever waited ahead. It was in this condition, starving, sick, and strung out across the mud of Picardy, that the English learned the French had at last got in front of them. Through all of it, Henry's grip on his army never slackened, and his discipline in these days was of a piece with everything else about him, total and enforced without sentiment. He forbade plunder and the burning of villages, partly from policy. He came by his own claim as France's rightful lord and not as a raider, and partly from a piety that was entirely genuine and entirely hard. The most famous instance the chroniclers preserve belongs to this march. A soldier was found to have stolen a pyx, the sacred vessel in which the consecrated host was kept, from a village church. Henry halted the whole army. He would not let it move again until the man had been hanged and the pyx restored to its place. It was at once an act of devotion and an act of command. A warning to a starving column that the enterprise was holy, that its discipline was not to be questioned, and that a king who would hang a common thief for a stolen vessel would spare no man who broke his order. The same faith that made him just by the lights of his age made him unbending. It is worth noting that the story reaches us at all through an eyewitness, a priest traveling with the host, whose account, the Gesta Henrici Quinti, is our closest window on these weeks, and who plainly recorded the hanging as proof of a godly king. This is the true texture of the march, and it is worth setting against the words the march is usually remembered by. Nearly 2 centuries later, William Shakespeare would give this campaign the most stirring language in the English tongue, the king moving among his men in the dark before the battle, and on the morning itself, the speech that named them, "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers." They are magnificent lines, and they are inventions. There was no band of brothers on the road to Calais. There was a column of sick, frightened, hungry men, held together by fear of their own king almost as much as by loyalty to him, trudging through the rain toward what most of them expected would be their deaths. The trap closed on the 24th of October. The French host, which had gathered and maneuvered faster than the laboring English, got across their line of march and drew up athwart the Calais road near the castle and village of Agincourt. The English came over a rise to find the way north filled with the enemy, a great mass of men-at-arms and horse whose numbers no one could count and no 2 chroniclers agree upon. That the English were badly outnumbered is certain. By how much is one of the most disputed questions of the whole war, with estimates running from a modest French advantage to the 4-fold, 5-fold, or greater superiority of the patriotic legend. Whatever the true ratio, the sight was overwhelming. A broad field, newly ploughed and beaten to mire by the rains, and beyond it the banners and campfires of an army that had every reason to expect it would destroy the invaders in the morning. Even now Henry did not simply resign himself to the odds. By some accounts he made a last attempt to avoid a battle he might well lose, offering the French terms for a free passage to Calais, even, it was said, the surrender of Harfleur, which they refused, certain of their numbers and content with nothing short of his own submission. But he had already made the one preparation that would matter most. Warned during the march that the French meant to break his archers with a charge of heavy horse, he had ordered every bowman to cut a long stake, sharpened at both ends, to carry on the road and drive into the earth before him when the armies closed. It was a small, practical, deadly piece of foresight, and it would turn the greatest strength of French chivalry, the mounted, armored charge, into a trap. For Henry's army was, above all else, an army of archers, common yeomen, 4 or 5 of them for every man-at-arms, drawn from the shires and trained from boyhood at the butts, the very men the French nobility most despised. On the morrow, those despised bowmen and their hedge of stakes would decide the fate of the flower of France. The night that followed was cold, wet, and, on the English side, all but silent. Henry ordered quiet kept throughout the camp, a discipline the chroniclers noted, and which later moralists took for the calm of a confident king, though it served the plainer purpose of holding frightened men in order. The soldiers made their confessions, priests moved among them, for many believed they would not live to see another night fall. Across the fields, the French, crowded onto sodden ground and sure of the outcome, are said to have passed the hours in noise and expectation, some accounts claiming they diced for the English captives they had not yet taken. The same rain fell on both armies. Henry made what dispositions the ground allowed and waited for the light. It came grey and reluctant over the valley on the morning of the 25th of October during Saint Crispin's day. The strip of drowned plough between the two armies was hemmed on either side by thick woodland that pinched the open field into a corridor barely wide enough for the great French host to deploy. The English drew up in their thin line, the men-at-arms in the center, the archers massed on the wings and waited on an enemy who did not come. For hours the two hosts faced each other across the mud, neither moving, the French content to let the smaller army stand and starve. At last Henry made the decision that would settle the day. Rather than wait to be worn down, he would advance his whole line into arrow range and force the battle himself. The order passed down the sodden ranks. The archers pulled up their stakes and moved forward through the mire. On a field in Picardy, a few thousand hungry Englishmen went to meet the flower of France. The English came on slowly because the churned ground would not let them do otherwise. The field between the woods of Agincourt and Tramecourt had been ploughed and then beaten by days of rain into a deep sucking clay, and its flanking tree lines pinched the open ground into a corridor scarcely wide enough for the vast French army to deploy. This was the terrain Henry had chosen, and the choosing of it was itself an act of generalship. It cancelled at a stroke the French advantage of numbers, funneling their host into a front no broader than his own. The English advanced a short way across the mud, halted within extreme bowshot, and hammered in again the sharpened stakes each archer carried. A bristling hedge angled to disembowel a charging horse. Then some thousands of longbowmen drew and loosed together, and the battle began as Henry needed it to begin, not with English steel but with a falling storm of arrows on an enemy who now had to come through it to reach him. Henry had drawn up his whole army in a single thin line, for he had no men to spare for a reserve. His dismounted men-at-arms stood in 3 blocks, the vanguard on the right under the old Duke of York, the main body in the center under the king himself, the rear on the left under Lord Camoys, and between and beside them, thrown forward on the wings, stood the great mass of the archers behind their stakes, their flanks anchored on the 2 woods so that the line could not be turned. It was a formation with no depth and no margin for error, and it would hold only because the ground and the stakes did what numbers could not. Everything depended on making the French come to him, across the mud, into the narrows, where their strength would become their ruin. The longbow was the weapon of a lifetime's practice, drawn by men bred to it from boyhood, and in massed volleys it did not so much aim as darken the air. The French plan opened with mounted charges on the wings, meant to ride down the archers before they could do their work. But the horses came on across a quagmire and into that hail, and the charge broke before it struck. Beasts pierced and maddened, wheeled and bolted back into the ranks behind them, throwing the French into confusion before a single blow had been struck hand to hand. Behind the cavalry came the main strength of France on foot, thousands of men-at-arms in full plate, the greatest lords of the realm among them, wading forward through mud that pulled the very boots from their feet. They advanced with heads bowed against the arrows as against sleet, into a killing ground that narrowed as they came, so that the press from behind drove the front ranks together until men could barely lift their arms. What followed was less a battle than a catastrophe of crowding. The leading French, exhausted by the wade and jammed shoulder to shoulder, struck the English line and could not bring their numbers or their weapons to bear. Those who fell or were pushed down could not rise in the mire under the weight of their armor and were trampled or smothered where they lay. Then the archers, their arrows spent, threw down their bows, snatched up mallets, hatchets, swords, and daggers, and fell on the floundering mass from the flanks. Lightly burdened and sure-footed on the ground that had ruined their enemies, they killed with dreadful efficiency, dragging down armored men and driving blades through the gaps in their plate, until, the chroniclers claim, the heaps of French dead and dying rose higher than a man, and the living clambered over their own to reach the English. For perhaps 2 or 3 hours the slaughter went on. When it slackened, the impossible had happened. The flower of French chivalry lay dead, dying, or captive in the mud, and Henry's small, sick, starving army stood in possession of the field. It was a victory that would ring across Europe, and its shape mattered as much as its scale. A small, sick, retreating army had not merely escaped destruction, it had shattered a far larger force of the finest soldiers in Christendom, and had done so through discipline, ground, and the humble longbow, rather than through the mounted chivalry that was supposed to decide such things. To the English, it was proof beyond argument of God's favor. To the French, it was a wound to the whole order of noble war. In a single afternoon, Henry had shown himself one of the most gifted commanders of the age. Through the worst of it, the king had fought on foot in the press with his men, in the center of the line where the fighting was thickest, a man of 29 wielding his own weapon in the mud, not watching safely from a hill. The chroniclers say the golden coronet fixed to his helm was battered in the melee, and that a blow struck a fleuret clean from it, that when his young brother Humphrey of Gloucester fell wounded, Henry stood astride his body to guard him until he could be dragged clear. English losses against the ruin of France were astonishingly light. The chronicles claim only a few hundred or fewer still, but they were not nothing. The Duke of York, the king's cousin, died in the crush, smothered or beaten down in his armor, and among the dead was the young Earl of Suffolk, whose father had died of the flux before the walls of Harfleur only weeks before. 2 heirs of one house gone in a single autumn's campaign. The cost to France was staggering, though it reaches us through the fog of medieval reckoning and English pride, and no exact count is possible. The dead were numbered by the chroniclers in the thousands, and they were not common men but the leadership of a nation. The Constable of France, Charles d'Albret, who had commanded that day, the Dukes of Alençon, Brabant, and Bar, a long roll of counts and lords whose houses were gutted in an afternoon. Great men were taken alive as well, held for the vast ransoms that were the whole economy of chivalric war. Among them Charles, Duke of Orléans, a prince of the blood and a poet who would pass a quarter of a century a prisoner in England, and Marshal Boucicaut, one of the most renowned soldiers in Christendom who would die in captivity. By every measure of the age it was a triumph without parallel, and the credit for it belonged in no small part to the king himself, to his choice of ground, to his discipline over a terrified army, and to the nerve that had held a thin line together against a host that should, by every expectation, have swept it away. And then, with the field all but won, Henry gave the order for which this day should also be remembered, and which the legend would quietly lose. The danger, by the accounts that survive, was not yet wholly past. The last French battle line, still uncommitted, stood at the far end of the field, and there were reports of it regrouping for a fresh assault. At the same moment word came that armed men had fallen upon the lightly guarded English baggage in the rear. Henry held, behind his exhausted line, a great crowd of French prisoners, more men, some said, than he had soldiers fit to guard them. Caught between the fear of a renewed attack to his front and the mass of captives at his back, who might, if the battle turned, snatch up discarded weapons and fall on him, the king made his decision. He ordered the prisoners killed. It must be stated plainly because the context around it has so often been used to bury it. These were disarmed men who had surrendered and thrown down their arms under the laws of war. Their lives had been promised in exchange for ransom, and they were now to be put to death in cold blood. The order revolted even the men who received it, and not only from conscience, for a live prisoner was a fortune and a dead one nothing, so that killing them beggared their captors along with their honor. The chroniclers record a hesitation, a recoil, a refusal to draw blades on the defenseless. Henry did not relent. He is said to have detailed a body of archers, men without the knightly scruple and without ransoms of their own to forfeit, to carry out the killing, and to have threatened death to any who would not. And so it was done. Surrendered noblemen cut down where they stood or knelt, and, in some accounts, a number of them herded into a building that was then set alight and burned with the men inside it. How many died in this way cannot be known. The greatest prisoners, Orléans, Boucicaut, and others worth the most in ransom, were spared, pulled clear of the killing, and the slaughter was halted once the feared counterattack failed to come. But the number is not the point, and neither, in the end, is the rationale. Men may argue whether Henry, with a broken army and no means to guard so many captives, had a soldier's reason to fear them at his back. What is not in doubt is what he ordered, and what was done. The deliberate killing of surrendered, helpless men on the direct command of the king at the very summit of his victory. It is the act the hero legend cannot hold, and it happened. Henry himself saw no stain in it. To the last he ascribed the whole day not to English arms, but to God, who had, he was certain, delivered the proud into the hands of the humble as a judgment. He forbade his men to boast of their prowess, ordered a solemn thanksgiving on the field of the slain, and carried that insistence home with him. The victory was heaven's and not his own. Within a year, Londoners would be singing the Agincourt carol, Deo gratias Anglia, rede pro victoria, England, give thanks to God for the victory, a genuine song of the time, which found room for God and for glory, but none for the prisoners in the mud. The same man, on the same afternoon, could kneel in real and humble gratitude to his God and order the throats of unarmed captives cut. This was not hypocrisy. It was the whole of him. In Henry, the piety and the ruthlessness were not at war, but were the single, seamless expression of a mind that believed itself the instrument of a just and terrible God. He turned from the field of Agincourt toward home and the adulation of his people, and toward the long, methodical conquest in which that same nature would show itself again, no longer in the fury of one desperate afternoon, but as cold and sustained policy. When Henry re-entered London on the 23rd of November, 1415, the city gave him a welcome such as no English king had known in living memory. The conduits ran with wine, the streets were hung with the cross of St. George, and vast, roaring crowds turned out to greet the victor of Agincourt as he came home. It was, in every sense, the birth of the legend. The moment the outnumbered gamble in a Picardy field became a national miracle, and the son of a usurper became, in the eyes of his people, a king visibly chosen by God. The pageantry was staged with deliberate art. The king was met outside the walls and brought in across London Bridge, where towering painted figures of a giant and a giantess stood as its guardians. At the conduits and crosses of the city, tableaux of angels, prophets, and virgins greeted him, and choirs sang as he passed through Cornhill and Cheapside towards St. Paul's. The chronicles dwell on the contrast between the roaring city and the man at its center, sober, unsmiling, and visibly unwilling to play the conqueror, even as London strained to cast him as one. Into that adulation Henry struck the note that would do more for his legend than any pageant. He rode through the celebration plainly dressed and with a grave, almost forbidding bearing. He refused to have his dented helm and battered arms paraded before the crowds, and he forbade the making of songs and verses in praise of his own prowess. The glory, he insisted, belonged to God alone. Whether this sprang from genuine humility or from the surest imaginable instinct for how a sacred kingship should present itself, and in Henry the two were never truly separable, the result was identical. A victory won by the arms of Englishmen was consecrated as a sign from heaven, and the king who declined the credit quietly gathered all of it to his crown. The Lancastrian claim, stained at its root, had found the vindication it had always needed, a success so complete that it could only be read as the favor of God. But Agincourt, for all its glamour, had won a battle and not a war. The French king still reigned, mad but anointed. The Dauphin and the great factions still held the bulk of the country, and the English claim to the throne of France stood no nearer to being made real than before the first arrow flew. A lesser or a more contented man might have banked the glory and made a favorable peace. Henry did neither. He grasped with the cold patience that was among his greatest gifts that a single victory settled nothing, and that France would have to be taken the way territory is truly taken, Not raided, but conquered, garrisoned, and governed, town by town and year upon year. The interval before he returned was not idle. For close to 2 years, Henry remained in England and turned his formidable administrative energy to the sinews of a longer war, money, ships, guns, and men, all prepared with the meticulous, account-keeping thoroughness that was as much a part of him as his devotion. Nor was France left in peace in the meantime. In 1416, the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund came to England and was drawn into alliance by the Treaty of Canterbury, a diplomatic stroke that isolated the French. And in the same year, an English fleet under the king's brother John, Duke of Bedford, broke a Franco-Genoese blockade to relieve the still-held port of Harfleur, keeping open the door through which the next invasion would come. Command of the narrow seas was as much a part of Henry's design as any siege train. It let him move armies and supplies across to Normandy at will, and it denied the French the chance to cut him off from England as they had so nearly done at Harfleur. Nothing in these 2 years was accidental. Every month of apparent quiet was spent tightening the screws of preparation. Patiently, deliberately, Henry was assembling the conditions for a conquest. It began in the summer of 1417. In August, the king landed once more in Normandy, at the mouth of the Touquets, not as a knight-errant chasing another Agincourt, but as a sovereign coming to take possession of what he called his own. The campaign that followed was the true measure of Henry V as a soldier, and it looked nothing like the legend. Where the English wars of the previous century had been built upon the chevauchée, the swift burning raid meant to terrorize and plunder, Henry's war was a grinding, methodical machine of siege and occupation. He came with a great train of artillery, engineers, and miners, and he reduced Normandy the way a mason takes down a wall, one stone at a time. He began deliberately with Lower Normandy, meaning to secure a solid base before he lunged at anything greater, and he made Caen the anchor of the whole conquest. His method rarely varied. The great guns would be brought up and set to battering a chosen stretch of wall. Miners would work beneath it. The town would be formally summoned to surrender and offered terms if it yielded, the harshest usage if it forced a storm. Some places, having seen what befell those who resisted, opened their gates at the first sight of his army. Others held and paid for it. Either way, the end was the same. Another town garrisoned, another stretch of the duchy brought under English law, and the machine grinding on to the next. The first great stone was Caen, taken by storm in September 1417 after his guns had breached its defenses. The storming was followed by a sack, and the sack by slaughter. The chronicles report the streets running with blood and the dead counted in their thousands, though such figures are never to be trusted whole. Even here the pattern of the man showed itself. Henry is said to have ordered the killing stopped once the town was securely his, and to have spared women, children, and priests, mercy and massacre issued by the same authority on the same day as calculated instruments of control. Then the machine moved on. Bayeux, Alençon, Argentan, Falaise with its great castle, and after a long and stubborn siege, the port of Cherbourg, the names fell one after another through 1417 and 1418 in a steady, relentless progression until almost the whole duchy save its capital lay in English hands. This was conquest as industry, and Henry ran it as much like an administrator as a general. His army was governed by written ordinances of war. His supply was organized down to the detail. His commanders were chosen for competence rather than blood. Behind the advancing sieges came the whole apparatus of a state, garrisons installed, French officials replaced with English, oaths of fealty exacted from the surviving inhabitants, taxes assessed, coin struck, and in the emptied towns, Harfleur and Caen among them, English settlers planted to hold what English arms had taken. Henry did not mean to ravage Normandy and leave. He meant to keep it, to make it English, and to rule it as its lawful duke. For a few years, he very nearly did. What he set up was the government of a duchy, not the plunder of a campaign. At Caen, he established the financial and legal machinery to run Normandy as an English possession. He confirmed or replaced local officials, set the courts working again, and required the conquered to swear loyalty to him as their duke. To captains and soldiers who had served him, he granted forfeited Norman estates, binding their own fortunes to the permanence of the conquest, and into the emptied ports he brought English settlers to make the holdings English in fact as well as in name. It was slow, costly, unglamorous work, and it was exactly the kind of work at which Henry excelled. The reason his conquest, unlike the burning raids of earlier English kings, actually took root in the ground. The cost of that ambition was paid, as always, by the people in its path. A conquest measured in sieges is a conquest measured in hunger, for the siege was Henry's chosen weapon precisely because it spent the defenders and the townsfolk rather than his own soldiers. Behind the orderly progress of the king's forces lay burned outlying villages, ruined harvests, refugees crowding the roads, and towns bled and cowed into submission. The Norman peasantry, caught between the English hammer and the wreck of their own nobility, bore the weight of a war conducted with a patience that never tired and a conscience that never flinched. For Henry held with total conviction that he was Normandy's rightful duke and France's rightful king, and that those who resisted him were not honorable enemies but rebels against the order of God. That certainty made him consistent, and consistency in a conqueror is another word for relentlessness. He was not given to the fits of rage or the erratic cruelty of some of his contemporaries. He was worse in a sense and more formidable, cruel and merciful alike by policy and never in doubt. It is worth saying plainly that this, and not the glory of Agincourt, was Henry's true military achievement. Anyone may win a battle through a day's courage and luck. Few medieval kings could take a province and hold it, and fewer still could turn conquest into working administration. The systematic reduction of Normandy revealed a mind of the first rank, patient, organized, tireless, and perfectly clear about the difference between winning ground and keeping it. But it revealed, too, that the ruthlessness of Agincourt had been no aberration of one desperate hour. It had become method. The same king who could spare women and priests at Caen could starve a town without a flicker, because sparing and starving alike were merely the instruments of a conquest he believed God had commanded, to be used each in its place as the work required. By the middle of 1418, only one prize in Normandy still defied him, and it was the greatest of all. Rouen, the ducal capital, one of the largest and richest cities in France, girded with formidable walls and packed with defenders and refugees, stood upon the Seine like a standing challenge to his whole enterprise. Henry turned toward it, knowing that it would not fall in weeks. Its walls were too strong to storm and its people too many to overawe. It would have to be starved. And in the long winter siege that followed, the method that had carried him across Normandy, patient, disciplined, and without mercy for those it broke, would reveal, more nakedly than anywhere else in his reign, exactly what it was. Henry came before Rouen at the end of July 1418 and made no attempt to take it by storm. The city was far too strong for that, a great walled capital on the Seine, its ramparts studded with towers, its garrison and citizens swollen by the country people who had crowded inside for safety, so that tens of thousands of mouths now sheltered behind the walls. Against such a place the king reached for the weapon he trusted above every other: time. He drew a ring of fortified lines clean around the city, dug trenches and threw up bastions, barred the Seine above and below with piles and chains, and cut Rouen off from all relief. He would not spend his soldiers against the walls. He would let hunger open the gates for him. The siege works were themselves a feat of engineering and a measure of how total Henry meant the blockade to be. He divided the ground around the city into sectors, each held by one of his great captains from its own fortified camp, so that the whole circuit of the walls was watched and sealed. He barred the Seine with a great chain and sunken piles to stop any relief or supply coming up the river, and threw a bridge of boats across it below the city to bind the two halves of his army into one. Nothing was to go in, no one was to come out. It was the same cold thoroughness he brought to everything he did, turned here to the slow strangulation of a city of many thousands. Inside, the siege sharpened slowly into famine. Rouen had laid in supplies to hold out, but it held more people than it could feed, and no relief came. The France beyond the lines was too broken by its own civil war to raise the army that might have saved the city. Through the autumn, the stores dwindled, prices climbed beyond reach, and then the food behind the prices simply vanished. The defenders and townsfolk ate their horses, then their dogs and cats, then rats, then boiled leather, while disease and starvation began to kill within the walls as surely as beyond them. The city's captain, Guy Le Bouteiller, held on into the winter in the hope that Burgundy or the Dauphin would march to break the siege. No one came. The siege ground on for close to half a year, far longer than a storm would have taken, but far cheaper in English lives, which was exactly Henry's calculation. Inside the walls, the ordinary order of the city dissolved into a slow catastrophe. The chronicles describe the sick and the starving lying untended in the streets, the price of a single loaf climbing past anything the poor could pay, and the desperate shifts of people who had already eaten everything that could be eaten. Rouen had defied him, and Rouen was dying for it, week upon week, behind walls he had not needed to breach. And so, Rouen's leaders made the calculation that starving fortresses had made before, and it became an atrocity through the answer it received. To stretch what food remained for the men who could fight, the city expelled those who could only consume, the bouches inutiles, the useless mouths, the old, the sick, the poor, and women and children in their thousands. Late in the year they were driven out through the gates and down into the broad ditch that ran between the city wall and the English siege works in the expectation or the desperate hope that Henry would let them pass through his lines to safety, as the customs of war sometimes allowed. A pious king, the reasoning ran, could not simply stand and watch the helpless die before his eyes. Henry did not let them pass. He ordered his lines held, and the crowd of non-combatants, the chronicles put them at many thousands, though no true count exists, was left where it stood, trapped in the ditch between the barred gates of the city that had cast them out and the English trenches that would not open. There, through the depth of a Norman winter, they died. Without shelter, without fire, and with almost nothing to eat, they perished of cold and hunger in full view of both armies, week after week, from the closing of the old year into the new. An English soldier who was present and who set the siege down in verse recorded what the men on the line saw. Infants born in the ditch and hauled up to the wall in baskets to be baptized, then lowered again to their dying mothers, the living lying down among the dead because they had no strength left to move them. At Christmas, the accounts say, Henry permitted a little food to be carried down to them and sent priests among them for the feast. Then the policy resumed, unchanged. What charity there was came in scraps and altered nothing. The ditch stayed closed and the dying went on. What made it terrible beyond the ordinary miseries of war was that it happened in plain sight and slowly and to people whom no one would call soldiers. The garrison on the walls above could see their own expelled townsfolk dying in the ditch and could do nothing for them. The English in their trenches could see them too, close enough to hear them cry out. Estimates of how many were driven into that space and how many died there vary wildly and cannot be trusted. The chronicles speak of many thousands, but the character of the thing does not rest on the count. Whether they were 5,000 or 12, they died of cold and hunger over months, penned between two armies because a king would not open his line. The city could not bear it and did not hold much longer. With its people starving within and dying without, and no army coming to its aid, Rouen surrendered on the 19th of January, 1419. Its garrison and defenses were delivered up, and Henry entered the capital of his duchy in state. He went first, as he always did, to give thanks to God. He rode to the Cathedral of Notre Dame and heard Mass in the city he had starved into his hands. The devotion and the policy were once again the same act, performed by the same man, on the same day. The reckoning that came with the surrender was in keeping with all the rest. A huge indemnity in gold was wrung from the ruined city. The chronicles name a figure of some hundreds of thousands of crowns, from a population that had lately been eating its horses and its shoe leather. The leading men made their submission, and a handful held to have offended the king in particular were singled out for punishment rather than mercy. Alain Blanchard, a captain of the townsmen, was taken and put to death. These were the terms of a conqueror who had won precisely what he set out to win and who had paid for it almost entirely in the lives of others. It is worth weighing exactly what had happened at Rouen and weighing it plainly, because it is the clearest window in Henry's whole reign onto what his ruthlessness really was. This was not the fury of a storming when discipline shatters and men do in minutes what will haunt them for years. It was not even the desperate calculation of Agincourt made in a single hour by an exhausted commander who believed an army was about to fall on his back. It was a cold, deliberate, sustained policy chosen and held to across the dead of winter by a king who prayed daily and believed himself the instrument of God. The decision, renewed morning after morning for weeks, to leave thousands of non-combatants to freeze and starve in a ditch rather than let them through his lines or lift the pressure on the city. He did it because it served the siege. The mass of the helpless in the ditch was a weight upon Rouen's conscience and Rouen's order, one more turn of the screw that was bringing the city down. The suffering was not incidental to the strategy. strategy. It was the strategy. No chronicle records that Henry took any pleasure in it, and there is no reason to think that he did. That is precisely what makes Rouen darker than ordinary cruelty. A man who delighted in suffering would be easier to understand and easier to set aside. Henry was something rarer and more disturbing, a ruler of genuine faith and iron self-command, who could look on the deaths of the helpless with steadiness, because he had persuaded himself wholly that the cause those deaths served was just and was God's. The same conviction that made him disciplined, tireless, and, by the standards of his own kingship, even just, was what allowed him to hold this policy to its end. The greatness and the ruthlessness were not two men uneasily sharing one crown. They were one man, and Rouen is where that man can be seen most clearly of all. It is telling that we know of the ditch at all. Much of what Henry's own chroniclers set down was meant to praise him, and yet the suffering at Rouen comes to us even so, recorded among others by an Englishman who had stood in those very siege lines and seemingly could not leave it out. Some who wrote of it tried to soften it, laying the blame on the city's own governors for expelling their people in the first place, as though that closed the question of who then left them to die. But the choice that kept the ditch shut was Henry's, made freely and held for months, and the men who were there understood it. The horror of Rouen was not dropped from the legend because it was doubtful. It was dropped because it was true. With the fall of the capital, the rest of Normandy came fully into his grip, and the duchy his ancestors had lost 2 centuries before was English once more. It had cost, among a great deal else, the lives of those who died in the ditch, whom no chronicle troubled to number. But the conquest of a province, however complete, had never been the whole of Henry's ambition, and even now his gaze had travelled beyond it. France itself still lay broken and at war with itself. A prize far greater than Normandy was coming within reach. As Henry secured Rouen and turned his mind toward the ruin of the French monarchy and the crown that might be wrung from it, the machine of his conquest rolled on toward a treaty that would seem, for one brief season, to place the whole of that kingdom in his hands. By the opening of 1419, with Rouen fallen and the leopards of England flying over the capital of Normandy, the duchy that had been the cradle of the old Norman kings was Henry's in all but name. Town by town, castle by castle, the rest of it came in through that year, and his administration, efficient, unforgiving, and permanent, took root in the conquered land. But Normandy had never been the object, it was the platform. Henry meant to have far more than a duchy. He meant to have the crown of France itself, and in these years, with a suddenness that must have astonished even him, the collapse of his enemies placed that crown within his reach, for France in this age was a kingdom at war with itself. Charles VI, the king his people had once called the well-beloved, and then, more quietly, the mad, had been sinking for a quarter of a century into recurring bouts of catastrophic insanity, spells in which he did not know his own name, his own wife, or his own children. Around a throne occupied by a man who could not rule, 2 great factions had torn the realm apart. The Armagnacs, who stood behind the king's son, the Dauphin Charles, and the Burgundians, who followed the immensely powerful Duke of Burgundy. Their feud had begun in murder. The Duke of Orleans cut down in a Paris street in 1407 on the orders of John the Fearless of Burgundy, and it had poisoned every attempt to unite France against the invader. Henry, patient and cold, had spent years exploiting that division. Now the division did his work for him. On the 10th of September, 1419, the feud consumed itself. John the Fearless came to a parley with the Dauphin on the bridge at Montereau, southeast of Paris, to negotiate at last a common front against the English. On that bridge, in the young Dauphin's presence, the Duke was struck down and killed by men of the Dauphin's party. Whether the Dauphin ordered the killing or merely failed to prevent it has been argued ever since. What mattered was the result. The murder shattered the last hope of French unity and drove the whole power of Burgundy in grief and fury straight into the arms of the King of England. It was said afterward that the English had entered France through the hole in the skull of the murdered Duke. The dead man's son and heir, Philip Taus, whom history would remember as Philip the Good, inherited his father's corpse, his father's enemies, and his father's power, and he made his choice with cold clarity. He would ally with Henry against the Dauphin who had murdered his father. With Burgundy now controlling Paris and holding the person of the Mad King, and with Charles's queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, willing to treat, the road to a settlement lay open. Through the winter and spring the terms were hammered out, not with Charles VI, who drifted in and out of his affliction, but with those who governed in his name. The result was the Treaty of Troyes, sealed in the cathedral city of that name on the 21st of May, 1420. It was the most complete triumph an English king had ever won over France, and it was written on parchment rather than won on a field. By its terms, Charles VI would keep his crown and his title for the remainder of his life, but he named Henry his heir and the regent of France to govern the kingdom during his incapacity and to inherit it entire at his death. The king's own son, the Dauphin Charles, was disinherited, set aside and declared unworthy of the succession on the grounds of the horrible and enormous crimes laid at his door, chief among them the murder at Montereau. The two realms of England and France were to be joined in Henry's person and in the heirs of his body, a dual monarchy spanning the Channel. Each kingdom, the treaty was careful to state, would keep its own laws, its own customs, and its own institutions, but both would henceforth answer to one sovereign, and that sovereign would be a Lancastrian. The document bore the seal of Charles VI, but the king who owned that seal could not have followed the half of what was done in his name. The true authors on the French side were the man and the woman who acted in the vacuum of his madness. Philip of Burgundy, bent upon vengeance for his murdered father, and the queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, who set her daughter's marriage and her own survival above the birthright of her son. Troyes was, in this sense, less a treaty between two nations than a bargain struck over the body of a broken king by a faction that had lost a duke and gained a foreign master. And Henry understood better than the crowds who cheered him the weakness of what he had been handed. A crown offered by the losing side in a civil war was worth precisely as much as the swords that could be made to stand behind it. To bind the two bloodlines, Henry would marry Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois. She was 18 years old, and her hand had been among Henry's demands since before the first invasion. Now she was the seal upon the whole design. They were married in the church of St. John at Troyes on the 2nd of June, 1420, less than a fortnight after the treaty was signed. To the men who had drafted it, the marriage was the capstone of a holy work, the merging of two crowns in one Christian prince. To the French who still followed the disinherited Dauphin, it was the sale of their kingdom to its oldest enemy, sealed over the body of a murdered duke and signed by a king out of his wits. For Henry, the achievement seemed to answer the whole anxious question of his house. His grandfather's line had taken the English crown by force. His father had held it through a decade of rebellion and suspicion, and now the usurper's son stood recognized as the heir to the most prestigious throne in Christendom, his legitimacy underwritten by the King of France himself. The stain of 1399 seemed, for a moment, to be washed clean, not by argument but by the visible, overwhelming favor of God made manifest in conquest. He had set out to prove that the crown truly belonged to his family, and here, written and sealed, was the proof. And yet the triumph was hollow at its very center, and Henry, the coldest realist of his age, must have understood it better than any man alive. The Treaty of Troyes was an agreement with a faction, not the conquest of a people. It gave him Paris, the northern towns, the legal titles, and the person of the Mad King, but it did not give him France. South of the Loire, across the vast heartland of the kingdom, the Dauphin and his supporters simply refused it. They called the treaty a treason and a nullity. They kept their own court, their own armies, and the loyalty of the greater part of the country's soil, and they proclaimed the disinherited prince the true heir of France. In time they would mock him as the king of Bourges after the town where he held his shrunken court. But the mockery could not disguise the fact that the man Henry had struck out of the succession still commanded more of France than Henry did. The consequence was written into the treaty from the first line. To make the parchment real, Henry would have to conquer everything it granted him, town by town, castle by castle, siege by siege, across the whole of a country that did not accept him. He had not ended the war. He had committed himself and his heirs after him to a war without limit. In the months following the wedding he took the field again at once, now with the Mad King and the Duke of Burgundy nominally at his side, reducing the Dauphinese strongholds that ringed the capital. The town of Melun, on the Seine, defied him through some 4 months of grinding blockade before hunger forced it down late in 1420. Its garrison had denied the treaty, and Henry treated them with the severity he reserved for those who denied his right. Then, on the 1st of December 1420, Henry and Charles VI entered Paris together in state, and the Estates of France assembled in the capital formally ratified the treaty that had made an English king the heir to their throne. In the capital, he turned to the slow, unglamorous labor that always followed his conquests, installing his officers, confirming ancient privileges, taking oaths from those who would swear them, and binding the machinery of French government to his own hand. The dual monarchy he had designed was not, on paper, the swallowing of France by England. Each realm was to keep its own parliament, its coinage, its laws, its language, and its offices, but a single Lancastrian king would sit at the head of both, and his heirs would sit there after him forever. It was an idea of breathtaking ambition, a state without precedent straddling the Channel, and for the moment it existed chiefly in the iron of Henry's own intention. Beyond the walls of the towns he garrisoned, out in the fields and villages of a country that had never consented, the treaty was so much foreign parchment. To be a subject of the English king in the France of 1420 was, for most, to be a defeated people taxed to pay for their own occupation, their loyalty held by garrisons, and their dissent answered with the rope. Henry did not hide this from himself. He had never mistaken conquest for consent. It was the summit of his life. He was not yet 34 years old, and he was the master of the North, the husband of a French princess, the acknowledged heir to 2 kingdoms, and the most feared soldier in Europe. But the man who had studied France so coldly knew precisely what the pageantry in Paris concealed. The peace of Troyes was not a peace at all. It was a promise that could be kept only by permanent war, an inheritance he could enter only by conquering it without end. He had reached for the greatest prize any English king had ever dared to want, and in the same stroke he had chained himself to a labor that had no conclusion. The machine that had carried him from the mud of Agincourt to the cathedral at Troyes could not now be allowed to stop. And Henry, 33 years old, and already, though he did not yet know it, nearer the end of his strength than the height of it, turned back toward the war that would have to be fought until France was wholly his, or until it killed him. For all that the Treaty of Troyes had been drafted to end the long war between England and France, it ended nothing. It changed the war's shape and its justification, but the killing went on exactly as before. To the Dauphin and the great territories that still held for him, the treaty was a dead letter, and the struggle for the soul of France entered a new and grinding phase, no longer a contest of rival claims to be decided in an afternoon on a battlefield, but a war of conquest and occupation that could end only when one side had ground the other entirely into the earth. Henry had made himself the heir of France. Now he had to take it, and there was no version of that task that would ever allow him to rest. First, though, he went home. He had not set foot in England for 3.5 years, and he had a new queen to present to his kingdom and, as always, money to raise for the war. Early in 1421, Henry and Catherine crossed the Channel, and on the 23rd of February in Westminster Abbey, Catherine of Valois was crowned Queen of England. The coronation banquet, held in Lent, was a great procession of fish rather than meat, dressed up with sugar sculptures of saints and the royal arms, and the crowds that had once cheered the victor of Agincourt now turned out to see the French princess who was living proof that the war had been won. The king took her on a progress through the realm, north to the great shrines and the loyal towns, giving thanks, showing the queen, and everywhere pressing his subjects and their coffers for the loans and the taxes that the endless war devoured. The pageantry was real, and so was its purpose. Even at the height of triumph, the machine had to be fed. For the war was devouring money on a scale no English king had ever managed to sustain. Agincourt had been glorious, and, by the measure of what came after it, cheap. The permanent occupation of Normandy and the unending sieges beyond it were neither. Henry borrowed without pause, and above all, from his great-uncle Henry Beaufort, the immensely wealthy Bishop of Winchester, who advanced the crown one enormous loan after another against the customs revenue and the crown jewels. The conqueror who bestrode Europe was, in the ledgers, a king steadily mortgaging his own kingdom to keep his armies in the field. It was another cost the legend would quietly lose. The great triumph in France was being paid for, in no small part, on credit, a debt his infant son would inherit along with the crown and would never be able to redeem. And then, in the midst of the celebrations, the first crack showed. On the 22nd of March, 1421, at Beaugé in Anjou, an English army under Henry's own brother Thomas, Duke of Clarence, blundered into a Franco-Scottish force. The Dauphin's men, stiffened by thousands of Scots who had crossed the sea to fight the English, and was broken. Clarence, charging ahead of his archers in his hunger for a stroke of personal glory, was killed, and a clutch of English lords went down with him. It was the first serious English defeat of the entire war, and it carried a double weight. It shattered the myth that English arms were invincible on French soil, and it struck at Henry's house directly. Clarence had been the heir, for the king as yet had no child of his own. The news reached Henry in England, and it ended the interlude at once. This war could not be managed from across the sea. On the 10th of June, 1421, he sailed for France again, leaving Catherine behind him. She was carrying their child, and stepped back into the war that would not release him. While he besieged and marched through the autumn, the event on which everything now depended took place without him. On the 6th of December, 1421, at Windsor Castle, Catherine gave birth to a son, a boy christened Henry, heir to the dual monarchy, the child in whom the crowns of England and France were joined in a single small body. It should have been the perfect consummation of the whole design. The Conqueror had his heir, the dynasty was secured, and the blood of the Lancastrian and the Valois kings ran together at last in one cradle. But the father was not there, and never would be. Henry was hundreds of miles away in the siege lines of France, and he would die without ever seeing his son. Everything he had built, the treaty, the marriage, the towns bought with blood and treasure, now rested upon an infant he had never held, and upon the hope that the men who came after him would possess the genius and the terror to hold what only his genius and his terror had won. Catherine herself would cross to France in the spring of 1422 and be reunited with her husband near Paris that Whitsun, but she left the child behind in England in the care of others, a king already in all but name. The distance between the father and the son was not merely one of miles. Henry had built a throne of 2 kingdoms, and he would hand it to a boy he would never teach, never test, and never harden in the way his own bleak youth had hardened him. The whole edifice, the treaty, the marriage, the conquered towns, the vital alliance with Burgundy, had been raised by one man's relentless will, and it would descend, when the time came, upon a child who had inherited the crowns but could inherit none of the will that had won them. That was the flaw built into the very triumph, and it was already there, unspoken in the cradle at Windsor. For the war Henry had returned to was no longer the war of Agincourt. There were no more great battles in the open field, no more single afternoons on which a kingdom might be won or lost. There were only sieges, the slow, methodical industrial reduction of one fortified town after another, and the greatest and grimmest of them was Meaux. The town lay on the Marne, east of Paris, held for the Dauphin by a garrison under a captain the French themselves remembered as a brute, the bastard of Vorus, notorious for hanging his prisoners, and the poor of the countryside on an elm outside the walls. Henry laid siege to it in October 1421 and settled in, as he always did, to let time and hunger do the work of steel. But Meaux did not fall quickly. Through the whole of the winter and into the spring, the garrison held, first the town, and then its strongly fortified quarter called the Market, and the siege dragged on for some 7 months in the cold and the damp of the river valley. It was war stripped of every romance. There was no charge to be led here, no enemy to be met sword against sword, only the patient engineering of a town's death. The encircling trenches and palisades, the great guns battering the walls day after day, the mines driven beneath the towers, and above all the slow arithmetic of hunger, in which the besieger's whole task was to seal a place off from the world and wait for the people inside to weaken faster than his own army did. Henry had made himself the supreme master of this kind of war. He had also made himself its prisoner. Every town taken had then to be garrisoned and held, so that each conquest thinned the very army that was meant to make the next year, a machine that consumed its own fuel and demanded always more men, more money, and more time than any king could finally supply. And in those siege lines, as it had at Harfleur, and in every camp Henry ever kept, disease did its patient, invisible work. Dysentery, the bloody flux, the silent killer of medieval armies, which had always taken more men than the enemy, spread through the waterlogged trenches before Meaux. It killed his soldiers by the score, and at some point in that long, sodden vigil it reached the king himself. Meaux surrendered at last in May 1422, and Henry had his victory, as he had almost all of them. The bastard of Vorus was put to death, hanged it was said from his own tree. But the man who took the town was not the man who had begun the siege. The tireless king, the commander who had survived an arrow through the face at Shrewsbury, the desperate retreat to Agincourt, and a decade of unbroken campaigning, was visibly failing. He had driven himself for years without pause and without mercy, at a pace that left no room for recovery, in the settled conviction that the work was God's and that his own body was merely its instrument. His surviving letters and orders from these months are reports of cold, exact progress, the paperwork of a man who governed a war as another might govern a household. But the instrument was wearing out. The constant campaigning, the winters spent in drafty pavilions, the endless exposure to the foul air and fouler water of the siege lines, and the crushing weight of holding together a conquest that demanded his personal presence in 100 places at once, all of it was hollowing him out. He was 35 years old, the most formidable ruler in Christendom, heir to 2 crowns, and he was dying by inches in the mud of the very war he could neither win nor leave. For there was no natural end to the labor he had set himself. To make the Treaty of Troy real, he would have had to take and then hold the whole of France, siege by siege, for as long as the Dauphin and his followers drew breath, a war to be measured not in campaigns but in lifetimes. Every town in the south that flew the Dauphin's banner was a denial of the union he had forged at Troy. Every castle that held out was a wound in the legitimacy he had bled for. To Henry, whose piety left no room for the thought that he might be in the wrong, resistance to the treaty was not merely rebellion against a king, but defiance of God's own settled order, and so it could never be tolerated and never be finished. He had built an empire of parchment and blood, and staked it entirely upon his own unbreakable will, and his will was as strong as it had ever been. It was his body that had begun, quietly and irreversibly, to fail. The machine could not stop, but the man who was its engine had at the last met the single enemy that his discipline, his faith, and his military genius could not defeat. By the summer of 1422, the illness that had taken hold in the siege lines of Meaux would not loosen its grip. Henry pressed on for a time in the only way he knew, as though a war might be governed by will alone. He went to Paris, he attended to the ceaseless business of his double kingdom, and when word came that a Dauphinist army was besieging the town of Cosne on the Loire, and that his ally the Duke of Burgundy stood in need of support, the king set out to take the field once more, but this time the body would not answer. He was too weak to ride. The most feared soldier in Europe, who had spent the better part of a decade in the saddle, had to be carried, first attempting the road on horseback, then giving it up for a litter, and at the last brought by water and by carriage to the royal castle in the Bois de Vincennes, east of Paris. There the campaign ended, and there he would die. Henry V died at Vincennes on the 31st of August, 1422. He was 35 years old. He did not fall in battle, as the legend might have wished, nor at the hands of any enemy worthy of him. He died of dysentery, the same wretched camp sickness that had hollowed out his armies at Harfleur at Rouen, and before Meaux the disease that across his wars had killed far more of his men than French arms ever did. It was an unheroic end for the most celebrated warrior of the age, a slow wasting in a sick room, drawn out over weeks, finishing in exhaustion. The Conqueror of France was killed not by a French sword, but by foul water and the filth of the siege lines he had lived in for years. There is a temptation in the telling of such a life to reach for a grander ending. A wound taken in a last charge, a death among the banners. The truth is plainer and harsher. The same disease that had emptied his camps, bred in bad water and human waste and utterly indifferent to rank, worked through the king exactly as it had worked through the poorest archer in his host. For a man who had ordered his whole existence around the mastery of every circumstance, it was the one enemy he could neither outthink nor outwill, and it took him with the same slow indifference it had shown to thousands of nameless men before him. He met it, by every account that survives, without flinching. The accounts of his last days, set down by men who were near him, describe an end met with the same cold, exact self-command that had governed his whole life. There is no record of panic and none of self-pity. He did what he had always done. He attended to the work, knowing that his son was an infant and that his conquest was a thing held together by nothing but his own presence and the fear it inspired. He spent his failing strength arranging the government of 2 kingdoms he would not live to see. He directed that his ablest surviving brother, John, Duke of Bedford, should have the governance of his French conquest, the regency of France being offered first, it was said, to the Duke of Burgundy, whose alliance was the keystone of the whole edifice, and passing to Bedford only when Burgundy declined it. His younger brother, Humphrey of Gloucester, was to hold the chief place in England, and the care of the infant king was entrusted to tried men of his household. Above all, he charged those about him to hold fast to the Burgundian alliance and never to surrender Normandy, the two things upon which he understood better than anyone his entire achievement depended. He thought of the child, too. The upbringing of the infant king he placed in trusted hands, among them his own uncle, Thomas Beaufort, Duke of Exeter, and the Earl of Warwick, who would have the raising and the schooling of the boy. And he set down, so far as a dying man could, the shape of the two governments that would rule in his son's name until the child was grown, his brothers at the head of each realm, a council of lords beneath them, and over all of it the standing command that the conquest was to be defended to the utmost and never bargained away. It was the last campaign plan of a man who had spent his life making them, an order of battle drawn up against a future he would not be there to command, for a war he seems already to have suspected could not be won without him. To the last, the fierce and genuine piety that had run through his life like a vein of iron did not leave him. He had the 7 penitential psalms read aloud at his bedside, and when the reading reached the verse that prayed God to build again the walls of Jerusalem, he is said to have stopped it, and to have declared that, had he lived and won his peace, he would have gone on crusade to recover the holy city. Whether the words were exactly as they were later reported cannot be known, and no honest account can pretend to his private thoughts. But the sentiment was wholly of a piece with the man, who had spent his life certain that he was the instrument of a divine purpose, and who seems to have gone to his death still believing it. When he was pressed about the great prize that was now so near, the crown of France itself, for the ailing Charles VI could not long outlive him, he reportedly set such talk aside. He had done, as he believed, what he had been set upon the earth to do. The rest he left to the providence he had served. The irony of the timing was as sharp as anything in his life. The crown of France, which the Treaty of Troyes had promised him, and toward which 2 decades of war had been bent, was a matter of weeks from his grasp. Charles VI, the mad king whose heir Henry had made himself, died on the 21st of October, 1422, barely 7 weeks after Henry himself. Had Henry lived to the autumn, he would have been proclaimed and crowned King of France in fact as well as in title. Instead, the 2 crowns he had fought so ruthlessly to unite passed in the same season to a child not yet a year old, the infant Henry VI, King of England and, by the terms of Troyes, King of France, who could neither speak nor stand nor comprehend the smallest part of what had fallen to him. The machine that had never once been permitted to rest was stopped at the very threshold of total victory, not by any army, but by a sickness carried in unclean water. The journey home was a spectacle such as England had seldom seen. The king's body was embalmed and borne in a great funeral procession the length of his conquests. From Vincennes through the towns of Normandy he had taken by fire and siege, Rouen among them, to Calais, across the sea to Dover, and slowly up through England to London. Atop the coffin lay a lifelike effigy of the dead king, robed and crowned, with scepter and orb set in its carved hands, so that the people who lined the roads might see the majesty they had lost. Thousands of torches burned along the route. The black-clad cortege moved at the pace of mourning. Churchmen and lords walked behind it in their hundreds. The whole vast performance was designed to declare that Lancastrian power had not died with its author, that the dynasty endured, that the conquest would hold. Among the mourners who followed the body was a king in all but liberty, James I of Scotland, held captive in England for 16 years, who had campaigned at Henry's side and now walked in his funeral train. Behind the cortege, in her own slow procession, came the widowed queen, Catherine of Valois, 20 years old, returning to a kingdom she barely knew, bearing home the body of a husband to whom she had been married for barely 2 years. The dead king's household knights, his captains, the bishops and lords of 2 realms moved with the torchlit column through town after town, and everywhere the bells tolled and the requiems were sung for the man who had seemed, only a year before, on the very verge of ruling half of Europe. On the 7th of November, 1422, Henry V was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey at the eastern end of the shrine of Edward the Confessor, the sainted royal ancestor into whose company he had deliberately chosen to be gathered. In time, a chantry chapel would rise above the tomb, a soaring structure of carved stone in which priests would sing masses for his soul in perpetuity. A last calculated assertion, in death as in life, of a piety and a majesty meant to endure forever. There was a design in the very stone. Henry had spent his whole reign atoning for the manner in which his family had come by its crown, reburying the murdered Richard II with honor, founding religious houses, hearing mass with a devotion that never wavered, carrying his faith like a suit of armor. His tomb completed that lifelong argument. Set among the sainted kings of England, watched over forever by singing priests, the usurper's son had arranged even his own death to declare that the Lancastrian crown was holy, legitimate, and secure. It was the last and most confident statement of a case he had pressed for the whole of his life. Within 30 years, every part of it would lie in ruins. To the mourners who filled the abbey, it was the burial of a hero without equal, the golden king who had humbled France, whose deeds would be sung in carols and remembered as the very measure of English kingship. They could not yet see what he had truly left behind. The victory was so complete that it looked eternal, and the man who had won it was scarcely cold. But everything he had built had rested upon a single irreplaceable thing: himself, his cold brilliance, his tireless will, the terror he inspired, the alliances that only he could hold together. That thing was now sealed in a tomb at Westminster. What he had left to his infant son was not a secure inheritance, but a debt beyond any child's paying, a war without end, a conquest that could not hold without him, and a crown that would prove, within a single generation, to be hollow. The age of the hero king was over. The age of the reckoning was about to begin. Henry V had built a triumph that only Henry V could hold. This was the flaw at the heart of everything he achieved, and it remained invisible for as long as he lived, because his own genius and terror concealed it. The conquest of France was not a system of government that could run without him. It was the projection of one extraordinary man's will, and when that will was sealed in a tomb at Westminster, the structure it had held upright began, slowly at first, and then all at once, to fall. It did not collapse the moment he died. For a decade, his brother, John, Duke of Bedford, governed the French conquest with much of the dead king's ability, and for a time the English cause even seemed to prosper. At Verneuil in August 1424, Bedford won a victory so crushing that men called it a second Agincourt. The Burgundian alliance held, the dual monarchy endured. But Bedford was not his brother, and no man was. The occupation of a hostile country the size of France demanded a king who never slept, never faltered, and never let the fear he inspired subside. And that king was in his grave. The turning came in 1429, and it came from the least expected quarter of all. An English army had laid siege to Orléans, the gateway to the Dauphin's lands south of the Loire, and the fall of the city might have finished his cause for good. Instead, there came out of the eastern marches a farmer's daughter from the village of Domremy, Joan of Arc, declaring that God had sent her to drive the English from France and to see the disinherited Dauphin crowned. She relieved Orléans. The French, who had lost battle after battle for a generation, suddenly began to win. And in July 1429, the very man Henry had struck out of the succession at Troyes was anointed and crowned Charles VII in the cathedral at Reims, the ancient coronation church of the kings of France. Joan herself would be taken by the Burgundians, sold to the English, and burned as a heretic at Rouen in 1431, in the very city where Henry had once left the poor to starve in the ditch. But her fire did not undo her work. She had given France back its belief in itself, and to that the machine Henry built had no answer. The keystone fell in 1435. At Arras, Philip of Burgundy, whose father's murder had first driven him into English arms, and whose alliance Henry on his deathbed had named as the one thing that must never be lost, made his peace with Charles VII and abandoned the English cause. The alliance on which the whole conquest rested was gone. Bedford himself died that same month, and with him went the last man who might have held the wreck together. Paris was lost the following year. After that, the English possessions in France came apart piece by piece, everything Henry had won unraveling faster than he had ever woven it. The systematic conquest of Normandy, the great grinding labor of his final years, was methodically undone. Normandy fell by 1450, and the Old English lands in the southwest by 1453. When the long war at last fell silent, all that remained to England of the vast inheritance of Troyes was the single port of Calais. The war that had opened with the glory of Agincourt closed nearly 40 years later in total defeat. The reckoning was appalling, and it fell upon both nations. The thousands who had died of the flux at Harfleur, the surrendered prisoners cut down at Agincourt, the old people and women and children who had frozen and starved in the ditch beneath the walls of Rouen, the soldiers rotted by disease before Meaux, and the king himself dead at 35, all of it had purchased a single generation of glory, and then nothing at all. The blood and treasure of two kingdoms had been poured out to raise an empire that evaporated the instant its architect was gone. But the deepest wound was the one England dealt to itself. The crown Henry V had polished to a lethal brilliance passed to a son who was in every way his opposite. Henry VI, gentle, devout, and wholly incapable of rule, subject in time to spells in which his mind failed him altogether, the same affliction, some observed, that had ruined his French grandfather, the mad Charles VI. Under such a king, the prestige of the monarchy collapsed, together with the conquest that had fed it. The treasury emptied, the great lords who had been held in check by the dead conqueror's shadow began to look upon the crown with appetite rather than awe, and the humiliating failure in France gave them both their grievance and their opportunity. The old stain that Henry V had spent his life trying to scrub away, the memory of 1399, of a crown seized by force from an anointed king, and of Richard II left to die in his prison, had never truly faded. Now it rose again to devour his line. The rivalries of the great houses erupted into the long dynastic bloodletting remembered as the Wars of the Roses, and in the end the usurper's grandson, Henry VI, was deposed, imprisoned and murdered in the Tower of London in 1471, killed in captivity, exactly as Richard II had been killed 2 generations before. The House of Lancaster, which Henry V had labored his whole life to legitimize, was extinguished root and branch. There was a bitter precision in how it came about. The House of York, which rose to challenge the failing Lancastrians, could trace its descent from an elder son of Edward III than the son from whom Henry's own line had sprung, which meant that once the Lancastrian mystique of unbroken victory was gone, the usurpation of 1399 was no longer merely a moral stain but a flaw in the title itself, an argument that could be made in law and then settled with swords. Everything Henry V had built abroad had been, at the bottom of it, a way of drowning out that argument with glory. When the glory failed, the argument returned, and it was answered in blood on English soil for 30 years. There is one last turn, stranger than any invention. Catherine of Valois, the French princess Henry had married at Troyes, was a widow of 20 when he died, and in the years that followed she formed an attachment, a secret marriage, most likely, to a Welsh squire of her household named Owen Tudor. From that obscure union descended a grandson, Henry Tudor, who in 1485 would take the crown on the field at Bosworth and found the dynasty that buried both Lancaster and York. So the French bride of the great conqueror became the grandmother of the House of Tudor, the house whose chroniclers would build out of her first husband the legend of the perfect hero king. For that is the final irony and the one this film has kept for the end. The Tudors, who had climbed to the throne over the wreckage of the very wars Henry's failure helped to ignite, and whose own claim to it was thin, had need of a heroic Lancastrian ancestor. Their chroniclers, Edward Hall, Raphael Holinshed, and the rest, reached back to Henry V and remade him, until the cold, calculating conqueror had become the golden, God-favored champion of the English past. And then, around 1599, William Shakespeare took that remade king and fixed him forever. He gave Henry a riotous, tavern-haunting youth he never had, and a fat, cowardly companion named Falstaff, a figure grown by a strange descent from a slander upon the real and really burned Sir John Oldcastle. He gave him the cry of "Once more unto the breach" before the walls of Harfleur, and upon the field of Agincourt the most stirring words in the English language: "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. They are magnificent, and they are inventions." And in the making of them, everything else was quietly allowed to fall away. The prisoners of Agincourt, their throats cut on the king's own order, are not in the play. The starving children in the ditch at Rouen are not in the play. The old comrade burned alive for his beliefs is not in the play. What remained was the radiant hero, and the radiant hero is what 4 centuries have chosen to remember. The wild youth story served the same purpose as the heroic king it produced. A prince who squanders his early years in taverns and then casts off his riotous friends to be crowned in sudden shining responsibility is a parable of conversion, of the crown remaking the man. And it is very nearly the reverse of the truth, which is that Henry was a grave and blooded soldier, scarred in battle at 16 and sitting on councils of state in his teens. But the parable was more useful than the fact, and more comfortable, and so it took root and endured. Generation after generation preferred the version that flattered it, until at last, for most who remembered him at all, the invention was the only Henry there had ever been. This film has tried to hold both images at once, because both are true and because they were never two men but one. Henry V was among the ablest kings England ever produced. Brave to the edge of recklessness, disciplined beyond any of his contemporaries, a soldier and an administrator of the first rank, and sincerely, ferociously devout. None of that is legend, all of it was real, and the film has given it its full weight. But those very qualities, the iron will, the tireless discipline, the absolute conviction that he did the work of God, were the same qualities that let him order the killing of thousands of helpless prisoners and stand unmoved while a city's poor died in the mud beneath his walls and send an old friend to the fire. The greatness and the ruthlessness were not opposites in him, held in some uneasy balance. They were the same nature, turned to different ends. He built the most complete victory an English king ever won over France, and he built it so entirely out of himself that it could not survive him, and it fell, within a single generation of his death, into catastrophe and civil war. Remember the field at Agincourt, and remember the ditch at Rouen that answers it. Remember the band of brothers. And remember the order to kill the prisoners, given on the very same afternoon. The hero the nation has always loved and the ruthless king the legend was built to hide are and were always the same man.